Introductory Material for In the North Woods of Maine by Elmer Erwin Thomas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Introductory Material. In the northeastern states, even in the remote sections, the virgin forest has disappeared, except for a few scattered remnants in the mountains. Yet only a comparatively short time ago, before lumbering operations had become extensive, the heavily timbered forests of northern New England were closely representative of the great virgin forest areas which covered the eastern states in colonial times. When Captain Thomas and his cousin went into the North Woods 50 years ago, they encountered essentially the same conditions that the colonists encountered when they settled New England. The Indians, of course, had gone, but the primeval forest was there, that same primeval forest which was at once a help and a hindrance to the first settlers. And in it these two Maine boys of 50 years ago lived, supporting themselves almost wholly by their own resources, just as the early settlers lived by their own resources when they opened up the great eastern wilderness. World Book Company thus offers In the North Woods of Maine as an authentic, first-hand picture of conditions similar to those met by the pioneers of 100, 200, and 300 years ago. Preface. Nearly a half-century ago, my cousin Frank and I lived alone, from September to April, in a wilderness cabin built with our own hands. In after years, when I told my two sons of these experiences, they asked me to write down the story of that winter, so that in the future they might recall to memory the tales of my life in the woods. Thus it was for my own boys that I first wrote this little story, but after I had written it, they persuaded me to go a step further and make a book, that all who loved the woods and the wildlife in them might have an opportunity to enjoy these experiences too. And so I offer it to the boys and girls of today, knowing that they will understand the great love for the open that has led me to write the book. E.E.T. Saranac Lake, New York. End of Introductory Material. Chapter 1 of In the North Woods of Maine by E.E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. How a Trout Gave Us an Idea. It was sheep shearing time on my father's farm in North Hartford, in the eastern part of Oxford County, Maine. This year, 1875, the weather had delayed the shearing until late in the spring. One sunny afternoon, Father sent me to the big pasture to salt the sheep and cattle, and also to see if the water in the pasture brook had become warm enough to wash the sheep. An overhanging ledge about 5 feet high stretched across the brook, and over this ledge the water poured in a thin sheet to a dark pool below. The pool was about 3 feet deep, and here, standing waist-deep in the water, we gave the sheep their yearly bath. As I stepped to the edge of the pool to find out how warm the water was, I saw a beauty trout dart from the shallow water up under the falls. I clapped my hand over my vest pocket. Yes, it was there. Most boys of my age were sure to carry a fishhook and a line. In a few minutes, the line was tied to a pole, and I was swinging the hook with a brookworm dangling from it up under the falls. Soon the trout grabbed the worm with a swift jerk, and I gave a much harder yank than I should have. Up went the trout into the air, and as ill luck would have it, the line wound several times around an overhanging yellow birch limb. With a wiggle or two, the trout splashed back into the water, leaving my line wound around one limb and my hook securely fastened to another. I was trying to get this mess untangled when my cousin Frank Thomas came along. As soon as Frank saw the tangled fish line, he started to pull at it. "Look out there, don't break it. It's the only one I have," I called out. "I guess we'll have to break it, or leave the whole thing here. It's a hopeless mess," replied Frank. Both of us worked hard at it, but the tangle would not straighten out, so we left it. We lay down on the warm sunny bank and talked over the prospects of fishing during the coming summer. Frank and I were always together, and we had hunted, fished and trapped all over the country near our home farms. On this day talk drifted to the fish, the big game and the fur-bearing animals that could then be found in abundance in the deep woods only 100 miles north of us. Our plans grew as we talked, and from a general notion of getting in some good fishing that summer, we worked around to a settled determination that in the coming fall we would spend 6 or 8 months hunting, fishing, and trapping in the region just beyond Moosehead Lake in the northern part of the state. We met with no great objections from our parents, so we began at once to make definite plans for the trip. We decided to ride by train from Livermore Falls, our nearest railroad station, to Greenville, on the extreme southern end of Moosehead Lake. Here we intended to buy 2 canoes to carry us across the lake and up the west branch of the Penobscot River, as far as it appeared to our advantage to go. Then we would build a log cabin, which would be our headquarters throughout the winter. We hoped that by hunting and fishing we could obtain a good part of our provisions, and by trapping we could get enough furs to pay our expenses and perhaps something over. All our spare time during the summer was spent collecting our outfit and completing the details of our plans. By the 1st of September our duffel was all packed in boxes. We had made these boxes small and uniform in size so that we could fasten straps to them and carry them on our backs without unpacking or disturbing the contents. In all, we had 12 boxes that averaged about 100 pounds each. For guns, we had Frank's 10-gauge muzzle-loading shotgun and my Smith & Wesson rimfire .44 caliber rifle. We thought this was the best combination. The last thing was to get our ammunition, and of this we laid in enough to account for nearly all the game in the north woods of Maine. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Off for the North Woods. At 7 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd day of September, we were seated behind Old Bill and Father's thoroughbrace wagon, with our luggage piled in the back, ready to start on our big venture. It is about 12 miles from North Hartford to Livermore Falls, but Old Bill made good time in the cool morning air, and in less than 2.5 hours arrived at the railroad station. Father helped us unload our luggage onto the station platform, and after saying goodbye to us, he drove off rapidly down the road. While we were waiting for the train, the crowd at the station examined our luggage and began to pass remarks for our benefit. One old hunter seemed particularly anxious to let us know what he thought of our plans. "Them fellers say they're going inter the woods ter stay all winter," he called out in a loud voice, "but I'll bet ye the best pair of snowshoes Uncle Robinson Gammon ever wove that afore the winter's half through, they don't get all chawed up, you'll see 'em back. And perhaps—" But just then the train came roaring in, and we were too busy getting ourselves on the train to hear the rest of his predictions. In a few minutes the conductor cried, "All aboard," and away we went. Our long and adventurous trip had begun. Yet, as elated as I was, a bunch came into my throat, and somehow it seemed hard for me to swallow. The ride on the train was tedious. We were going to Moosehead Lake, which was 100 miles north of us, yet in order to make connections, we first had to travel 25 miles to the southward. We got off at Leeds Junction, but here we just missed the train that would have taken us to Greenville that night. Late in the afternoon we arrived at Newport Junction, and decided to spend the night here, as it would be impossible to make connections for Greenville till the next day. The next morning we took the first train that left the junction for the north. We had to change 2 or 3 times this day also, and at each junction we lost a lot of time. Along about 10 o'clock that night we commenced to go through a long stretch of forest. The whistle on the engine kept blowing almost constantly. I said to one of the passengers ahead of us, "There must be a lot of crossings here," and she replied, "No, there hasn't been any crossings for over an hour. I guess they are whistling to scare the bobcats off the track." We were both glad when at 11 o'clock the trainman called out Greenville, Leaving Livermore Falls at 10 o'clock on the morning before, we had taken almost twice as long to get to Greenville as we had planned. We found lodgings at the hotel near the station and went to bed at once, for we had a long, hard day's work ahead of us on the morrow. The next morning we were up early, looking over the town. 3/4 of the people were Penobscot Indians, and those we tried to talk with could speak but very little English. After breakfast we began to hunt for something to carry our outfit the remaining part of the journey. It was no easy matter to find anything. At last we came upon what we wanted: 2 birch bark canoes, one 18 feet and the other 21 feet long. A little after noon we had our duffel all packed, and we were leaving civilization behind us. The afternoon proved fine, and we made good time across the lower part of the lake. About an hour before sundown I began to look for a camping place. I hated to cry quits, but my hands were blistered and my back ached, for this was new work for me. We had made about 17 miles as nearly as we could tell, for on our right, and a little way ahead of us, was what we supposed to be Mount Kineo, which is approximately 20 miles from Greenville, and about midway between the two ends of the lake. We spread a fly over us, and not long after dark we were fast asleep, nor did we waken until I thought someone was yelling at us. First I was somewhat dazed, but soon came to myself enough to know where I was. I was just dozing again when, but a short distance from shore, came the long-drawn cry of a loon. This time Frank awoke. We talked a while, then tried to sleep, but could not. The old duplex watch I carried went kerlink, kerlink. At last I struck a match. It was 4:15. So up we got and ate our breakfast, and were on our way again at the first peep of daylight, for we well knew that if several days of hard wind came along, we should be hung up, and we felt that our time was precious to us now. We passed Mount Kineo long before sunrise. Our route, which up to this point had been in a northwest direction, now turned sharply to the northeast. We held this course for about 15 miles, then turned northwest again and headed for northwest Cary. Here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as our canoe grated on the pebbles of the shore, the 40-mile paddle up the lake ended. There was a lumber camp at the Cary, and as it was then too late in the day to start hauling our outfit to the Penobscot, we decided to stay there until morning. We found bunk room with the lumberjacks in a large log house, and put in a good night's sleep. The rattle of tin dishes awoke us, but we did not turn out until we heard the cook yell, "Daylight in the swamp!" This brought us out. For breakfast we had baked beans, hot biscuit, and molasses, and tea so strong that a little dog couldn't make a track in it. We sat down to the table with 8 lumberjacks who were starting a small job near the lake, but before we had really begun to eat, they were through and away. We found a man with a pair of oxen who would haul our kit across the Cary to the West Branch for $3. In a couple of hours after our outfit had been loaded on the wagon, we arrived at the end of the Cary and tumbled our duffel off. The teamster shouted, "Gee, Star! Gee, old Turk!" and the oxen turned slowly around and started back for Moosehead Lake. We both stood watching until the wagon disappeared. That would be our last sight of civilization, or anything pertaining to it, for more than 6 months. Then we turned and looked at each other. We were alone. The tall trees overhanging the landing seemed to send their shadows through us. But we soon woke up, and without a word from either of us, our outfit was loaded into the canoes. In a few minutes we were again on the water. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Finding Camp and Snugging Down. First we passed through a small pond, then down a tributary stream a short distance to the west branch of the Penobscot. When we came to the river, we swung to the left and headed upstream, well knowing that our hard work was now ahead of us. Game signs began to appear on both banks. Ducks were plentiful, and we shot a few, but such small game seemed to us only a waste of ammunition, For surely the tracks on the muddy shores did look big to boys who had never seen anything larger than a coon's track. We paddled on up the river, eating our lunch as we went, for our main object now was to get there. The banks began to grow high, the water deeper and the channel narrower. About half an hour before dark, we selected a camping spot and unloaded the part of our kit that we needed to make camp. We first put up the fly, then made our bough bed. Home was complete. When the supper bell rang, the bill of fare consisted of broiled duck, flapjacks, and a tin cup of hot tea. Supper was soon over. Then we lay down on our bough bed. The stories we told that night were very short, and we were soon asleep. A little past midnight we were awakened by a splash bang. It sounded as if someone were throwing big rocks into the water. This was repeated many times during the night. In the morning we found out that we had camped just below a family of bank beavers, and it was the striking of their tails on the water that we heard. Beavers do this when they want to give an alarm, and as each beaver that neared our camping ground during the night caught a glimpse of our camp, he dived and whacked the water with his tail. At 4:30 breakfast was ready, with a different bill of fare. This time we had hot tea, flapjacks, and boiled duck. With our breakfast stowed away under our leather belts, we were ready to start on our way at daylight. In about 2 hours we came to Gulliver's Falls, the hardest pull of all. Gulliver's Falls are not really high falls, but a series of rapids, about a mile long. The water runs swiftly over small boulders, and the canoe has to be pulled or carried the entire distance. We could make better time by carrying, we found, and at it we went. The walking was poor, our shoulders got blistered, and it seemed as though we were 1 foot shorter that night than we had been in the morning. We had to go up the river about a quarter of a mile beyond the falls before we found a good camping ground. Here the river was shallow, and the banks quite low. We pushed our canoes up on the shore, and threw out what we needed for a night's rest. This time we were so tired we did not bother to make a bough bed. We just spread a few blankets down on the grass, and crawled in between them. And I can tell you, all the beavers on the west branch of the Penobscot could not have awakened us that night. We awoke at 7 the next morning, but did not hurry. We were so stiff and sore that we moved about as our old grandfathers used to. But when we went down to the river and splashed the cool water over our hands and faces, we washed out better than we thought we would, and after a hearty breakfast were soon on the move again. The river banks continued low, and the farther we went, the more game signs we saw. Some tracks were more than we could understand. There was one with 3 toes, about the size of the track of a fairly large dog. We learned afterwards that this was a wolf track, and that it looked as if the animal had but 3 toes, because the 2 middle toes were so near together. We caught glimpses of many animals, but we were so slow that they would get out of sight before we could get our guns to our shoulders. At last we came to the fork where the north and south branches unite to form the west branch. Both streams were quick water, and game signs were plenty, so why need we go farther? We began to hunt for a camping place, but darkness put a stop to sight hunting, and we once more rolled ourselves in our blankets to wait for daylight. As we were standing on the bank talking, after we had eaten breakfast the next morning, we noticed a small brook on the west side of the north branch. It looked big enough to work a canoe up, so we shoved the small one across, and found that we could get up this little stream more than a quarter of a mile. Though there were many bushes to bother us, it was a good place to hide our camp, so we returned for our other canoe. The big canoe gave us a little trouble, but we got there after a while. We found just the place we wanted, a small patch of level ground, facing the east, some 6 or 8 feet higher than the brook, with a small spring nearby, which would be just the thing for our drinking water. We both said, "This is the place," and started at once to plan our permanent camp. The first thing to do was to start putting up our log cabin. We got out the axe and buck saw and began to cut down trees and trim them up to make logs 14 feet long. Allowing for the notching at the ends, these logs would give us a camp about 12 by 12. On 2 of the sides we put all the butt ends together. As every log is always thicker at the butt end than at the other, by the time we had the walls up as high as we needed them, the top edges of these two sides both sloped considerably. This made a good pitch for our roof. We kept the front and back walls level by alternating the butt ends. We left an opening in the front and one in the back for windows. As we had no glass, we stretched thin cloth over these openings to let the light through. For the foundation of the roof, we fastened several poles about a foot apart across the top of the cabin. A short distance away we found some cedar that we sawed into blocks about 3 feet long and then split into shingles. By lapping the shingles about half their length, we had a fairly tight roof. But to make it warm, we covered it first with moss and leaves, and then put on another layer of shingles. This made a warm roof for our winter home. The walls and roof of our cabin were now done, but it wanted a fireplace to make it complete, for a fireplace is a very necessary thing in the North Woods during the cold winter weather. We had to make several trips to the river in our small canoe to get the stones for this work. We found some clay a short distance up the east branch. This is really the north branch, but we called it the east branch because it branched off toward the east. It took us a long time to gather our materials and make the fireplace, but when it was done we were proud of our job. The next thing was to build a shed for our wood, and also for the part of our outfit that did not need to be kept in the warm camp. We placed this about 6 feet from the cabin, and just opposite the door. We made a roof of poles and shingles between the cabin and the shed, and then closed up the rear, which was the side away from the brook. The front we left open. This gave us a little open shed or passageway between the two buildings which would be protected from both the cold winter winds and drifting snow. We were 8 days building this camp, and a cozy one it was, too, with ample room for any work that must be done inside the camp, including stretching hides and making snowshoes. After making a bunk, a table, and a few other necessary items of furniture, we moved in. Our work of snugging down for the winter was now complete. We did not fear the coldest or stormiest weather that might be in store for us through the long winter months ahead. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Our First Adventures in Hunting and Trapping. When the cabin was done, we decided to explore the region about our camp, and if possible, to locate and bring in some game. In planning out our winter's supplies, we had figured that fresh meat would have to furnish about half our diet. Yet we had nothing but ducks, and we wanted more variety. So the following morning we started up the brook on which we had located our camp. Frank chose the left bank, and I went up the right. We were to keep about 100 yards apart. We had gone a third of a mile or so when we came to a pretty little pond which was about half a mile long. The shores were low and grassy, and there were deer tracks everywhere. We agreed to meet at the upper end and went back into the woods. I was very near the appointed place when a large doe walked out from behind a thicket. I fired at her, and she ran around the end of the pond toward Frank. Soon 2 reports came, and as I met Frank, he said he had missed a big doe. We went back, and by the signs we saw that he had hit her. We followed but a short distance before we found her. Then when we examined her closely, we saw that we both had shot at the same deer, and didn't it look big? This was the first wild deer that we had ever seen in the woods. Now that we had meat enough to last us for a while, we spent the next 10 days in building deadfalls and mink houses and spotting lines for traps, so when the season opened we should be ready for business. The days had already begun to grow cool, and we had many frosty nights. While at our work we had an opportunity to obtain a number of partridges or ruffed grouse, which gave a pleasing variety to our diet. We also caught glimpses of deer almost every day, but did not care to kill more than we wanted to eat. As we were going up to the pond one morning, we saw some fish jumping near the outlet, and Frank said, "There is our chance to get some suckers for bait." I crept up carefully and saw what all the fuss was about. We had found a large spawning bed, and Frank's suckers proved to be trout. The water was about 20 inches deep, and such a sight! There were many tracks on the banks to indicate that the place was known to animals that loved trout. So here we planned to set some traps and benefit by what we had found. When the 1st of October came, we began our trapping in earnest. We had already chosen our routes. I selected the one that led up the north branch past Canada Falls, and Frank took the one that followed the east branch as far as Leadbetter Falls. We set and baited more than 80 traps the first day. Muskrat was what we wanted first, to use for bait. They were hardly worth catching for their fur alone, as kits sold for 3 cents and old ones for 5. The first week we caught more than 300 rats, 4 mink and 1 coon. Then we stopped trapping rats and trout for mink, coon, sable, and fisher. It was the second week in October that we lost track of the days of the week. Frank said it was Thursday, and I said it was Friday. We had forgotten to bring along a calendar. So we set up a cedar slab beside the door and agreed that the first one out in the morning should cut a notch on it and cry "Tally 1." On the following Monday morning my trap line led me past Canada Falls to the meadow ground, then past Mud Pond and Hold Pond. This line was about 18 miles long. I'd covered about 3/4 of the distance when I came upon fresh caribou tracks, and as I saw that, the caribou were feeding and going my way. I began to go very cautiously and to watch for any movement that might betray the whereabouts of the drove. Just as I came in sight of Hold Pond, I heard the cracking of bushes, as if by some heavy animal. The spruce and balsam trees were tall and thick. Then came a heavy growth of cedar near the water's edge. As I crept down in the direction of the noise, I caught a glimpse of 2 animals working toward me. I began to get anxious, lest I should lose the game so near, but soon a shoulder shot presented itself, and without seeing the head I pulled the trigger. A combination of squeals and bawls followed the report. The bushes crashed, and things were in a mix-up. Then the other animal darted into view, and again I shot, and this time there was more squealing and bawling than before. The second animal I had shot at now broke out of the thicket and ran straight for me, but dropped within 4 or 6 rods of me. Then I saw it was not caribou that I was shooting at all, but calf moose. The caribou tracks had led me to the pond where the 2 moose happened to be feeding. I did not have much time to examine my prizes. Before the smoke of my rifle had cleared away, there was another crash in the thicket, and out rushed the ugliest old cow moose I have ever seen in my life. She stopped for a second, and then charged at me. I had a fresh cartridge in my rifle, and I pulled on her, but the rimfire missed. I pulled again with the same result. The cow was now within 15 feet of me, so I turned to run. But I had no time to select my course, and in my great haste my foot caught on something, and down I went. A small spruce tree had blown over, and I found out afterwards that it was one of the roots that had tripped me. I saw the upturned tree and realized that it was my only chance. I rolled over toward the trunk, which is about 3 feet from me and about 2 feet above the ground. I was clinging to my rifle, but as the old cow struck at me, she knocked it out of my hand. I didn't stop to see where it went. What I wanted was to get down under the spruce as quickly as possible. The cow was going so fast she did not stop when she struck at me, and went several feet beyond. But before she could turn around, I was on my hands and knees under the tree and was crawling as fast as possible toward the top, for there was much more shelter there. It seemed but a second before she was at me again. This time it was not a running game, but a stand-still match. She struck at me with wonderful speed, and each time she struck, she got a little nearer. Then she stopped to look at her calves. This gave me a chance to crawl farther into the top, and now I felt more secure. When the cow saw that the calves were still, she came for me again, but seeing me in the top of the tree, she jumped over it and tried to get at me from the other side. For a few minutes she made no gains. Then she began to break the limbs in her rushes to get at me. I very soon realized that my shelter would not last long, and that there was but one thing to do, to climb some tree. Every time I got a chance I would look for a suitable tree near at hand. I saw one, a balsam, with the lower limbs about 7 feet from the ground. When the cow started to change back again to the other side of the tree, I pulled off my coat and watched for my chance. The fallen tree was now between her and the balsam. This, I hoped, would keep her from reaching the tree before I did. My chance soon came. As the cow made a dash, I threw my coat in her face and ran for my life to the balsam. I jumped for the lowest limb and drew myself up, but I had no time to spare, for the coat was not what the old cow wanted. I felt perfectly safe now, sitting on a balsam limb with 15 feet between me and the moose. But as the sun went down, it began to grow uncomfortably cool, and my coat was over by the spruce tree. The old cow seemed to know that she was beaten this time, though she would not leave me. She kept going over to the calves and then coming back to me. As night came on, I began to shiver. It grew cold fast. My teeth chattered and I shook. Could I stand it till morning? Last an idea struck me. When I was a small boy, I used to climb up to crow's nests in the top of the trees, and it was warm work. So I began to climb up and down as fast as I could, and in a short time I got well warmed up, all but my hands. This climbing worked all right as a remedy for cold, but it caused the old cow to double her vigilance and keep quite near. I could not see her, but could hear her walking about. At about 2 o'clock the moon rose, and as the wind lulled I could hear the falls roar. Under almost any other circumstances this would have been enjoyable. About 4 o'clock the old cow gave up and left. My stay was short in the tree after that. I collected some dry limbs the cow had broken off the down spruce, and in a few minutes had a good fire burning, but it was quite near the balsam in case she might return and try to get even with me. Daylight came at last, and I found my rifle about 10 feet from where I fell. My coat was a thing of the past. The cow had stamped and torn it till I could hardly tell what it was. The palms of my hands were all covered with balsam and bark from my night's climbing, and I set out for camp, stiff, sore, and hungry. Frank was outside the door waiting. He was going to start after me in a little while if I had not come. I did not tell him the details of my experience till I had eaten about 3 square meals, for it had been more than 24 hours since I had eaten anything. After breakfast we went back and dressed out the 2 calves. We now had a plentiful supply of fresh meat, and the very choicest, too. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. A Mysterious Night Visitor. The muskrats that we had caught had been skinned and put in a pile at the end of the shed. On the morning of the second day after my encounter with the cow moose, we were up early, and I went to the pile of muskrats for some bait. I saw that the pile was shrinking fast, and I called Frank. He said he surely carried away nothing like the number of rats that were missing, so we built a snug little house around the pile to protect those left. That night we were sitting by the fire, watching the changing, fantastic shadows come and go, when a sound from outside caused both of us to look up at each other. Something was trying to get at our muskrats. I lit the lantern. Frank got his gun, and we crept toward the door. I raised the latch and gave the door a push. Frank was ready, but he didn't shoot. He was too slow. We saw a gray streak go through the air and out into the woods, and we both agreed that whatever it was, its speed was almost unbelievable. "Guess we had better begin to trap nearer camp," said Frank, and so we put in a trap beside the pile. We should have done this at first, but we hesitated to do it before because the place was so very near our door. At any rate, our ghost did not return that night, so we were still puzzled. The next 3 days it rained hard, and when it cleared off, the water had risen so much that we knew we could not get to half of our traps along the river. While we were waiting for the water to go down, we carried the small canoe around the falls and started to explore the river above. We found many signs of game, but the water was so swift that it was very hard work to make any headway up the river. Many moose and deer were going across the ford at the meadow grounds about 3 miles above the falls. Nothing had disturbed our muskrats for 4 nights, but the 5th night we were awakened by a growl and squall combined. The next thing, we could hear our trap going through the woods. We knew it had some company to help it along. We dressed as quickly as possible and set out after the intruder, but he had got out of hearing, so we went back to bed. We had seen him move, and the more we thought it over, the more we preferred daylight for the next look. We had been thoroughly awakened by the dash out into the woods, and could not get to sleep again. After a while we decided to get up and build a fire. I looked at the old duplex watch. It was 3:30. Seemed a long time after we had eaten breakfast before we could see to travel, but we had to wait, for we must have good light to follow the trail. We started out slowly and had gone about 20 rods when we came to a place where the clog had caught under a root. And here the animal had chewed on everything within its reach. Finally it had loosened the clog and gone on. We followed 8 or 10 rods farther and came to a thicket. The tracks went in, but didn't come out. The thicket was about 8 rods across. I was in no hurry now, and Frank stood back and said, "Age before beauty." But just then I had a tender feeling in my feet and did not want to step on the animal, whatever it was, so we both walked round the thicket several times. We threw clubs in from various directions. At last we got a growl, and then we had him located. But such a growl! And it came nearly from the center of the thicket. We separated and began to work in on the quarter. Suddenly Frank said, "I see him." The next was a report from the old 10-gauge, and then a kicking in the bushes. Soon all was quiet. And now we were bold. We found that our night visitor was a very large lynx that must have weighed 35 pounds. After getting one look at his teeth and claws, we were not surprised that he could do so much damage to the bait pile. But he had made his last meal from our muskrats. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Getting Ready for Cold Weather. It was now late in the fall, and it would not be long before real winter weather would begin. There were several small jobs that needed attending to before we began our winter's work in earnest. The weather had not grown as cold as we had expected, and we found it necessary to move our meat into camp and smoke it in order to save it. To prepare it, we first cut it in long strips. Then we made a brine by mixing 1/2 sugar and 1/2 salt, and dissolving as much of this mixture as the water would hold. After the meat had been in the pickle for a while, it was ready to smoke. We built a small log house, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and about 4 feet high. Before we put on the top, we hung our meat on small sticks placed crosswise of the house. At the bottom we left a small opening, so that we could regulate our chip fire. When we started our first fire, the smoke came out from cracks everywhere, but we managed to stop most of it by plugging the crevices with moss. We put in 6 fires before we tried our cure. Finally we got our meat smoked, and what a fine flavor it had. We put it in boxes in the shed, and kept it for our lunches at noon. If we had not had so much moose meat on hand, I might have taken more interest in a moose trail that crossed the river just beyond the meadow ground, near a place where there were several beaver houses, built by bank beaver, which are no different from those that build dams, except they are lazier. The trail was being used by a good-sized moose, but I had not taken any pains to get acquainted. I was not eager for more experiences like the one I had previously gone through. In fact, I should have been tempted to go around a long distance any time I thought there might be an old cow moose with 2 calves directly in my trail. One afternoon I was paddling slowly down the river, and as I neared the moose ford, I thought I could hear something walking in the water. It sounded like big game, and surely what could it be but the moose? Yes, I thought, it must be the big bull that was passing through so often. If I could only see him! But the nearer I got to him, the more cautious I felt. I could hear the water every few minutes go slush, slush, slush. There was not a tree within 15 rods of the river bank, nothing but alder bushes, and the water at the ford was not more than 2½ feet deep. Yes, I could hear him walking. The current began to move a little faster, and I felt the canoe gather momentum. Soon I came to the place where I could see the trail less than 75 yards away. I backed water hard to hold the canoe in position for me to shoot if he came in sight, but he didn't come. Every few seconds I could hear him just below the bend. I was getting anxious. I must do something and do it quick, but still I waited. Suddenly the thought came to me, what a mess! Back here at game and don't dare to go where it is. Then I nerved myself for the occasion, laid my rifle across my lap, and took several short, powerful strokes with my paddle. This, I was sure, would bring me around the bend and quite near the ford. I had made up my mind that if I missed a vital spot at such a short range, I would surely get killed, and that the wreckage of the canoe would indicate the location of my body. For without a tree to climb, an experience like the one I had with the cow moose would be my last. Yes, I was scared, and I will admit it. But the surprise in store for me made me feel so cheap. Instead of a monster bull moose walking in the water, there was only a family of muskrats playing. An old rotten log had drifted down and jammed into the bank, so that one end stuck up about a foot above the water. The rats would chase one another up the log, and then dive off, one by one, into the water. I knew then what buck fever was, and it was a lesson I have never forgotten. That night when I told Frank about my adventure, he had a good laugh, and said he guessed he would have to go with me after this. He joked me much about my buck fever, but it wasn't long after he had an experience which proved true the old saying that he who laughs last laughs best. The warm fall weather at last gave way to cool days and freezing nights. The small brooks and lagoons began to freeze over, and this made our walking easier. We were now bringing in a good quantity of fur every day, but we could see that twilight came much earlier. We had caught several messes of fine trout, but as careful as we were, our flour and canned goods were going much faster than we wished to see them go, and we realized that we must increase our meat diet. Our shoes were getting to be cold things, but we had the moose hides, and with these we knew we had warmth and comfort. The first thing was to get the hair off, and this we did by putting them in running water, and letting them remain there about 10 days. As the water was very cold, it took a long time to get the right cure on them. After scraping and pulling all the hair off, we rolled them in salt and alum, and then kneaded them every night for 4 nights. Finally, we washed them out in several baths of warm water, stretched them, and tacked them up inside the camp to dry. This gave us a fine hide for moccasins, which we made by a pattern cut out of old cloth. We made them much larger than we thought we should want them, and even then the first time we got them wet, they shrank so much that it was almost impossible to get the things on. But we were not to be beaten this way. We made 2 pairs of wooden laths about the size and shape of our feet, and when our moccasins got wet, we would shove these hunks of wood inside, and as they dried out they would retain about the size required for our feet. The ground by now had frozen quite hard. Then came about 6 inches of damp snow, followed by rain. That settled the covering of the ground down to about 2 inches of slush. Then it cleared off, and the stuff froze as solid as snow and water could freeze. Now we had not made any woodpile at our door, and we thought this fine slippery going should be used while it lasted. So we went to work in earnest, and how that woodpile did grow! In 3 days we had our shed filled, and also a big pile outside the door. This wood was to be saved as an emergency store for very stormy or cold weather. Things were now moving our way very nicely. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Winter brings bear meat and a wolf hide. One morning we found that about 3 inches of snow had fallen during the night. The top layer was quite damp, but after sunup the wind began to blow, and it grew cold fast. By noon the wind was blowing a gale, and there was just about enough crust to hold up a partridge. I got about half my route when I crossed a beech ridge. Many beech nuts had been blown off, and they were lying on the light crust. I stood still and looked up the ridge in hopes of seeing something taking advantage of this wonderful picking, where there was not a leaf or a burr to bother. I worked up the ridge about 100 yards, brushed the snow off an old log, and sat down to watch for some motion on the snow. I looked up the right-hand side of the ridge as far as I could see, then across and back down the other side. This I repeated many times. At last I got tired and had shouldered my rifle to go when I saw what looked like a big black stump coming down the ridge. When it got in plain sight, I saw that it had 4 legs to carry it, and what a surprise it was for me. I had never before seen a bear in the woods, and as he came slowly down the ridge, swinging his head first one way and then the other, picking up all the nuts he could reach handily, I did feel rather queer. I began to look around for something to retreat to, preferably a tree, for the old cow moose had taught me what a good friend a tree can be. About 10 feet away there was a small beech tree with 2 or 3 limbs 6 or 8 feet from the ground, which seemed to be the best refuge in sight. As the bear was nearly 150 yards away, I edged over to the tree and stood as still as a stump. On came old Bruin, regardless of the shaking boy beneath the beech sapling. And didn't he grow big fast? He had stopped picking up nuts and was walking straight toward me. When he was about 75 yards away, I thought it best to begin my work. I was surprised at myself that I had stopped shaking and was quiet. I whistled once, twice, but he didn't stop. I yelled "Hi," and he stopped. I was ready and fired. He whirled and tried to bite at something that had hit him in the shoulder. This brought him broadside, and he stopped long enough for me to get one back of his foreleg. This one seemed to madden him, for he started for me in a businesslike way that made me slip in the next cartridge, double quick. As soon as the sights were on him, I pulled again, this time hitting him in the other shoulder. He slowed down to a walk, then lay down, rolled over on his back, pawed the air, and howled. In a short time he was quiet. I didn't run up to him at once. In 10 minutes I was ready to claim my trophy, but at my first move he started to get up. I was ready for him, though, and the next bullet had the desired effect. After I had dressed him out, I started campwards, and a happier boy never pulled the latch string on a camp door. The next day we went to our trophy. Before we began to skin him, we measured him, and found that he was 8 feet 2 inches long, from his nose to his hind foot. As I rolled him upon his back, his forefoot was a trifle over 3 feet 4 inches high. We removed the hide, cut him up, and brought back to the camp the hide and what meat we could carry. We had to make 3 trips to the beech ridge before we had him all in camp, for we estimated that he dressed more than 400 pounds. We had more than 2 gallons of fat that we tried out, and in this we fried many nice batches of doughnuts. One day I made good time and was back at the woodpile nearly an hour before dark. I carried in the wood for the night, brought up a pail of water, and busied myself with other camp chores until darkness caused me to stop. Then my thoughts were of Frank. It was long past time for his return. I stood outside the camp door and was watching for him when I heard his old gun ring out, but it was a long way off. I ran into camp, got my rifle, and fired 2 shots to let him know that I had heard him. Then I lit the lantern and started down the trail as fast as I could go. After I had covered about a quarter of a mile, I heard Frank speak, so I stopped and waited for him to come up. As he came into the glare of the lantern, I saw that he had something hanging over his back, and when he let it fall on the snow, it struck heavy. "What in the world have you there?" I said. "Look and see for yourself," he replied. What I saw when I held the lantern close sent a cold feeling up and down my spinal column, for there, with the top of his head blown off, lay a large wolf, nearly black. I began to question, but Frank told me to wait until we got to camp, so I gave him the lantern and I shouldered his burden. We were soon at the camp, and as I turned to swing the wolf from my back, I saw that his nose almost hit the floor. Then Frank told me his experience. He had been bothered by red squirrels springing many of his traps, and it had taken many times to reset them. While working at this, he saw a deer and shot at it, and as he saw it was hit, he followed it a long way. When he returned to his line, he found that darkness was coming on, and that the best thing to do was to hurry back to camp. His trail led past the trunk of a big hemlock that had been blown down a few years before. As he was walking beside it, he saw what he thought was a partridge running along on it just ahead of him. Small bushes had grown up on both sides of the log, and these, combined with the dusk, made it hard for him to see the bird clearly. He thought it was very unusual for a partridge to be out on a log and running when it was so dark, but he decided that if the bird didn't fly, he would try to shoot it. As the bird neared the end of the log, it looked as if it dropped down on the snow. Frank watched for a chance to shoot, and as he saw the bird move out a little past the end of the log, he fired in hopes of hitting it in the back, so that he might bring the breast home to eat. He ran up to the log, expecting to see a dead partridge there, but instead of a bird, he had shot what would pass for a black wolf. Evidently the wolf had run along behind the log. Frank had seen only his head, which could easily be mistaken for a partridge in that dim light. The next day we returned and looked the tracks over. The wolf had followed Frank for nearly a mile, creeping up closer with approaching darkness, and using trees, rocks, and bushes for cover. He had managed to keep from Frank's sight till he came to the old hemlock log where he was mistaken for a partridge. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Another mystery. As the season advanced, we brought in some of the farthest traps, and built trap houses over many of the others so the deep snow would not bother our sets, and on every trip we watched for white ash. We needed some of this wood to make snowshoes of, for we well knew that deep snow would soon be on us, and we wanted to be ready for it. We had saved a deerskin for rawhide and had prepared it, and after we had found a suitable ash, at the work we went. In about 6 days we had 2 pairs of snowshoes that, well, we were not so proud of their looks, but we knew they would hold. The following Monday morning we were up early and were ready to start on our lines at daylight, and as we stepped outside the camp door, we noticed tracks across the brook that looked as if they had been made by some heavy animal. On examining them, we saw that they were otter tracks going up the brook, so we started out after them. We soon reached the pond and saw that the otter had started to cross. We followed on, but soon came to a halt, for there, some 10 rods from the shore, was a hole in the ice about 2 feet across. The snow was all trodden down around it, and on the farther side lay a trout half eaten. But where was the otter? After waiting a long time, we finally made up our minds that he knew where he was going, and that we would not pry into his business any further, that day at least. We then began to examine the hole more closely. The water was about 4 or 5 feet deep. We could plainly see the bottom. The sand was boiling up from a space about 1 foot across, and every few minutes bubbles would rise. We concluded that there were other animals beside otter that had a tooth for trout, and decided that here would be a good place to slip in 2 or 3 good traps. But our other traps needed our immediate attention, for during the last 7 days almost 10 inches of snow had fallen. This made in all about 20 inches of the stuff to wade through. The last part was as light as feathers, and our snowshoes would sink in nearly half the depth, and this made us lame, for it called on unused muscles to lift the snowshoes out of the feathery mass. Wednesday night I was home early. I had untied my snowshoes and stuck them in the snow beside the door and was brushing the snow off my breeches when I thought I heard Frank yell. But the sound did not come from the direction that he would be coming from, and it was against our rules to make any more noise than necessary. So I listened for the next sound, which soon came. This time I knew it was not Frank. It sounded as if the animal was about 1/4 of a mile off and on the ridge to the right of the camp. As I stood and listened, Frank came up the float and joined me at the camp. Then we listened together to the greatest concert I have ever been permitted to hear in all my life. A second voice had joined the first. The newcomer was on a ridge near the river, and as the two yelled, they traveled toward each other. The nearer they came to us, the more intense became the power and quality of tone. The racket they made was terrific. The nearest I can describe it is that it sounded like the noise made by two old tomcats yelling as hard as they can, and the whole thing multiplied by about 15 times. We listened to this concert for 10 minutes, then all was quiet. We both said that we had supposed that it was impossible for any animal in the North Woods to make such a noise as this. One thing was sure, we had no intention of troubling the pair or in any way interfering in their twilight row. We decided that when daylight came we would find where their quarrel took place, but when we went out the next morning it was storming, and snow enough had fallen to cover up the tracks of the evening songsters, so we gave up track hunting and went to our traps. My day's catch was quite slim because of so much snow, but of course we could not expect that it would rain porridge and that our bowls would be right side up all the time. When Frank came in late that afternoon, he had a pleasant expression on his face. He told me that his traps were snowed in the same as mine, and he had taken but little fur. But on crossing a bog he saw something new. 7 caribou were coming straight for him. He was selecting the 2 best ones to drop, when with a snort the leader whirled and away they all went, and Frank's shot was at whatever he could get, instead of what he wanted, and he got the smallest one in the drove. The next day we brought the caribou into camp. It was a 2-year-old and dressed about 125 pounds, so this made our meat supply quite large. Though our deer meat was almost gone, we now had jerked, cured, moose, bear, and caribou meat. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our biggest day's catch. Our last 10 days' trapping had not been very satisfactory, and we decided to do a little more exploring. With a good lunch of dried moose meat and 2 large biscuits, we left camp before daylight and started for a section that was unknown, at least to us. And in the whole day's tramp we did not see the marks of an axe or any indication that a human being had ever been there before. The following morning we started out again for more exploring. We crossed the pond above our camp and were in the woods again before sunrise. As we followed up the stream, the land rose rapidly, and we could hear many little waterfalls beneath their snow-bound winter quarters. After about 3 miles of this climbing, we came to a different kind of country. The ground was nearly level, and many boulders almost as large as a small house were lying on the ground. It seemed as if they were not more than 75 feet apart. The trees were mostly stunted spruces and balsams. I told Frank that this was the most spooky place I was ever in. Here we began to see many moose, deer, and caribou tracks. The brook gradually widened, and was, as nearly as we could tell, about 20 feet wide. Then we came out upon a bog a half-mile long and nearly as wide, and covered with scrubby spruce trees about 20 feet high. The snow had clung to the limbs and bent them down so that the trees looked like big haystacks covered with snow. Here we saw that many small animals had been traveling about, and some had got into the tent-like shelters. We brushed off the snow from the side of one of them, and saw that these were surely snug homes, for no cold could reach the sheltered trunks that were so securely wrapped in their winter blankets. At the upper end of the bog, we found there were 2 streams that united, and as the right-hand one was the larger, and offered the smoother traveling, we followed it. Upon entering the woods again, I looked at my watch. It was 11 o'clock. Game signs were more plentiful, so we traveled on. When we had gone but a short distance in the woods, we came to what we thought was a bobcat's or lynx's tracks, and as the cat was going in our direction, we naturally followed. We soon came to another track, made by an animal going in the other direction. This track turned and went toward a small tree, and it looked as if the animal had been dragging something or crawling on its belly. Now this began to be interesting, and we went more cautiously. The cat had gone to within about 100 yards of a windfall. Then it had doubled on its tracks, and seemed to be skulking behind every bush and tree to cover its approach to the windfall. As we rounded the upturned trees, we saw the cause of this detour and its results. There, lying on the snow, was a small deer partially eaten, and by its looks it had been killed within the past 24 hours. There had been but very little struggling in the snow. The cat evidently knew how to do the trick. We now wished for a trap, but wishing wouldn't bring one to us, so we made a house around the carcass and said, "Tomorrow we will slip a trap in there." The next morning the first rays of daylight found us with 25 traps on our backs, hurrying toward the deer, and at 10 o'clock we were at the carcass. After setting 2 traps, we began to drag the remainder of the deer down the float, and to cut off a piece about every third of a mile, and put a trap beside it. And as there were many signs of fisher and sable, we felt sure of good luck with these traps. We had to start for camp a long time before we had all 25 set and baited, but the remainder could be set by the one who was to make the rounds the next morning, and we drew lots to decide who should go on this line. Frank was the lucky one. I was a little disappointed, for I wanted to see the cat that had so cleverly outwitted the deer, and as it was the 3rd night, we were sure that he would be caught in one of the traps. I made the look over Frank's line and part of mine, and returned to camp by dusk with 2 fisher, 3 sable, and 3 mink. Frank had not arrived, but when I was building the fire I heard the squeak of his snowshoes on the snow, and he opened the door and threw in his day's catch, which was 1 lynx, 1 fisher, and 2 sable. This was our red-letter day, as this was the most valuable catch we got in any one day that winter. It was long past midnight when we had finished skinning and properly caring for our furs, but before going to bed we consulted the slab calendar, and with joy we saw that this was Saturday. Our much-needed rest would be welcomed by us. We had not figured up the time of late, so we sat by the cheery fire and found that, as nearly as we could estimate, Christmas would be the next Saturday. But where had we lost Thanksgiving? As we looked over our flour, we saw that it was more than half gone, so we said, "More meat for us." Coffee we had figured as a Sunday luxury. Black tea without sugar was our drink at morning and night, and at noon cold water satisfied our thirst. Thus far we had been perfectly healthy. We had gained in flesh, and were feeling all cat and half wild. We surely had begun to look wild, at any rate. We had made our caps out of muskrat skins. They were warm but not handsome. Frank had made himself a pair of pants out of the moose hide, but when I made mine they came short 1 leg, so I had to use deerskin for the other leg. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Frank sees a panther. Friday night, Frank came home exceedingly happy. He had had good luck with his traps, and besides he had shot a small buck that dressed about 80 pounds and was not more than a mile from camp. After supper we planned our program for Christmas Day. Frank was to go to the pond and catch a few trout, and during that time I was to make something to haul the deer out on. We went to bed early that night. We lay in our bunks and talked of home and Christmas and what Santa Claus used to put in our stockings. The fire burned low, and slumber soon came. The next thing I knew, Frank was grunting and kicking me with all his might. It required a lot of shaking to rouse him out of his nightmare. He had dreamed about catching a fisher that got out of the trap and was jumping at him, and he was trying to kick it, but the kicks all landed on me. I lit a match. The watch said 4 o'clock, and then we exchanged Christmas greetings. Breakfast was ready early that morning, for we could not go to sleep, and at daylight Frank started for the pond for trout, and I went at building a sled. First I cut 2 long slender beaches about 2 inches through at the butt. I found the way that they would bend best, and shaved the bark off the side that would naturally lie on the snow. Then I nailed in position 3 short pieces to serve as bunks. Next came 8 small sticks about 1 inch through and about 4 feet long. These I nailed lengthwise on top of the bunks. And there was our sled. The small ends of the runners served as shafts, and with this arrangement we could easily drag our sled over any log we could step over. I had the sled ready when Frank returned, and his remark was, "If that thing doesn't put life into that deer I shot when we come in sight of him, I miss my guess." Frank had 8 trout that he had caught at the boiling spring, and they averaged about 3 to the pound. These we dressed and had for our breakfast. It was 10:30 before we were ready to start after the deer. Frank thought he had better leave one of the guns at the camp, so I left my rifle and he tied his gun to the sled. We moved fast over the good float, and were soon at the deer carcass. Nothing had disturbed it. We turned around and then loaded it and tied it to the sled. I stepped out of the path to cut a stick when a rabbit ran out from under a bush, past Frank, and into a small swamp or thicket that we had gone around to save cutting a road through. Frank said, "Don't we want him to help out on our Christmas dinner?" and added that as he was in the shafts, I had better take his gun. After I had shot the bunny, I was to go across the swamp. He would draw the deer around, and the one that got to the sharp bend first should wait for the other. I untied the gun and started on the trail of the rabbit. He had stopped under an old root, and I almost stepped on him before he moved, and then he was so quick I missed him. But before he had gone a great distance, the second barrel stopped him. I loaded up, and then went on. As I neared Frank, I saw that he was very pale. "Are you sick?" I asked. He made no reply to this, but said, "Look at that big windfall." Big drops of sweat were standing on his forehead, and I stood and looked at him instead of at the tree. But at the first glance at it, I saw that some large animal had been walking back and forth on the fallen hemlock. Then Frank told me of his close call. With a smooth float, he had made good time and had just come to the appointed meeting place when he saw something move. He stopped, and as he did so, a big cat-like animal sprang up on a log and poised for a spring at him. He dropped the shafts, and as he was just pulling the sled out of a hollow, it ran back about 2 feet. This attracted the cat's attention. Surely he saw the deer on the sled. He looked back at Frank, then at the deer again. In a moment he changed his position a little and prepared again to spring, but the combination puzzled him. He would rub his head on the side of the log and work his claws, as a house cat is seen so often to do. Frank said he knew it meant death to move, and that his only chance was to stand still. Then came the 2 reports from my old gun, not more than 75 yards away, and like a flash the big cat whirled and with long bounds disappeared in the cover of the forest. Now this was anything but pleasant, for we knew that we had to deal with an animal that was to be dreaded. We pulled the deer to camp, dressed it out, and added it to our supply in the shed. We put extra fastenings on the boxes containing our fresh meat, so that if any animal troubled them we should be awakened by the racket. That night our talk was on a different subject from the preceding evening, and we decided that we should not feel safe until we had that cat's pelt hanging up to dry with our other furs. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Panther Hunt. On the following morning, with a generous lunch, the bear trap, and both guns, we started out to find the home of the big cat. We soon reached the place where Frank had seen it, and were on its trail but a short time before I acquired much respect for his or her catship, for once in a while it would make a leap from one log to another that would cause us both to stop and look at each other. There was no need of words to express the thoughts of either of us. The tracks led us through swamps and over hills, and it was nearly 11 o'clock when we reached the cat's home. The den was hidden somewhere in a mass of large boulders piled one on another, and such a pile! As we walked around it we saw tracks everywhere. and all of them were of the same huge size. We cut a clog for the trap, then selected the most trodden path, which led to a hole. We found that in order to make a good set, one of us would have to go down between 3 boulders 6 feet high. One of them shelved inward at the bottom, making a little protected pocket where many dry leaves had been blown in during the previous fall. This would make an ideal place for the trap. But after we had it set, who would go down into the cat hole and place it? Neither was anxious for the job, but as Frank had the scatter gun, the most effective at short range, I slid down and Frank handed me the trap. Soon I had it neatly covered and the clog properly concealed. But in doing this, I never took one eye off the depths of that cat hole. We returned to camp, feeling quite sure that in a short time we should have the cat's pelt, and that our minds would then be at ease again. The next day we looked at our traps, for it had been 3 days since our last look. We both got good catches, and after supper we sat before the fire and stretched our furs. As the following day was Sunday, we lay in our bunks till hunger drove us out. When we finally got up, I began building the fire, and Frank took the pail and started for some water, but in a few minutes he returned with an empty pail. "What's up now?" I asked. "Has the brook run dry?" "Come and see for yourself," he replied, and started out. I followed, feeling a little puzzled. "Look over there," he said, pointing to some tracks. A large animal had traveled around our camp several times during the night. We examined the tracks as best as we could, but because of a light snowfall in the latter part of the night, we were unable to decide what the maker of those tracks looked like. "Well, I will get the water now," said Frank, and picking up the pail, started for the spring. He was nearly there when he called out, "Here are fresh tracks, come and see." And there they were. 4 feet had struck in the path, as if the animal had dropped down from the sky and then walked off. After circling the camp several times, it had sprung into a yellow birch tree not more than 15 feet from the waterhole, and there it had roosted snug to the body of the tree, and waited for the first of us to show himself at the spring. But daylight had apparently changed its mind, for it had gone away. We followed its track to the snowshoe float, where the surface was hard, and now we were sure it was the big cat. Our breakfast that morning was not relished as much as usual. We talked the matter over. We were hunters, and we were hunted, and we were both glad to come to an agreement not to go to any more trapping lines alone, and to do our work by daylight, at any rate until after that cat was killed. We knew that our bear trap had not worked. If we had some poison, we might get some down him, so we looked our kit through and found this idea must be given up, for a small bottle of castor oil was the most powerful thing in our medical collection. We talked about that cat all day, and at night the water pail was filled and the wood in long before dark. The last few days' experience had somewhat turned the tables, and it was a long time before we were to start on our homeward trip. That night, when bedtime came, we were not as sleepy as usual, and when Frank was putting on more wood, he remarked that it seemed to be storming, for drops of water and snow hit his hand when he went for the wood. I opened the camp door to see if he was right, and he surely was, for in came countless numbers of snowflakes driven by a strong northeast wind. This, we knew, meant more work. The storm was worse than any of the other storms. It kept right at it all night and most of the following day. About 4 o'clock it had all snowed out. Then we took a snowshoe apiece and shoveled the path to the spring, clearing out the shed, and measured the snowfall. We found that about 2 feet 4 inches had fallen. With the other snow there was almost 5 feet on the level, and it was so soft that game could travel but little. We were 5 days digging out and resetting our traps. We found that we had not made proper allowances for such deep snow. The trap houses should have been about 3 times as deep, and our traps should have been placed in the back part, where the snow could not cover them up or interfere with their springing. We were only pupils, but we were surely getting our education. After we made sure that our traps were well taken care of, we decided that this would be the time to get after the big cat again, as the deep snow would make it more difficult for him to travel through the woods. So we put the neck bones of the caribou, with a flank trimming, into our pack and started again for the cat's house. It was hard walking, but at 11:30 we arrived at the big rock pile. The trap we had left there was still empty, though tracks showed that our game was at home. We made a very careful survey. There were many holes where the cat could go in and out, but we had planned something different this time. At last we found what we were looking for, a hole with but little depth and not too wide. Then we threw the bones and meat into the farther end, got our big trap, and placed it in the entrance. After carefully covering it, we struck out for camp, and at about 4:30, 2 tired boys loosed the rawhide strings on their snowshoes in front of their cabin door. During the next 2 days we visited our traps with very poor results. As we were eating breakfast on the 3rd morning after our return from the cat's house, I said, "Frank, I have a feeling." But before I could finish my sentence, he said, "I've been afraid that I should have a feeling that I didn't want ever since I saw that cat on the log beside the snowshoe float." But Frank didn't believe in my feelings, and so we postponed going to the trap until the next day. The next morning we were off again for the cat's home. On the way, Frank joked me about my feelings, and when we arrived at the rock pile, I think I was more surprised than Frank to see that the trap was gone. Something had started to go in after the bait and had been caught in the act. But where was it? We examined the tracks and found where the clog had made several hits in the snow, and less than 100 feet from the set, we found where the animal had gone in under a big rock. This was another case of age before beauty. To say that we boys were excited does not express it in the least, but we soon calmed down and began to figure on how to get the cat out. We both crept in at the same time, Frank on one side of the hole and I on the other. It was quite dark inside, but after waiting a few minutes, we saw what had happened. There were 2 small rocks about 10 feet back from the entrance, with a large rock laying against them in such a way that there was an opening both above and below the point where they joined. The cat had gone inside on the rush. When he came to these 2 rocks, the clog had run under, the cat had gone over, and the chain had drawn down into the crack before the 2 rocks. We could see the clog and most of the chain, but that was all. There was not even a rattle of the chain links to let us know that we still had the longed-for paw between the jaws of the big trap. Hurry? No. We were not in a hurry. We sat and watched and listened, but not a sound or movement. One thing we both realized, the animal came out and jumped at either of us. After he had twitched the chain out of the crevice, there was nothing to stop him but our guns. At last Frank picked up a small stone and tossed it over the chain. It rattled down and stopped. Then all was still. He tried a second one. This had the desired effect and more, for the growl that came out made us both jump back. We expected to see the animal make a try for us, but it did not show itself. After a while we both crawled back, and Frank held his gun ready to shoot at the first move in sight, while I tossed small stones over where the cat was. But try as hard as we would, we could not get our game to show even the tops of his ears. We surely would not go any farther into that hole. We were not looking for honors. So we backed out and talked it over. We had him, and still we didn't have him. How should we get him out? At last we decided to build a fire and smoke him out. To smoke the animal out would be a big job, for the hole was large. There was plenty of dry stuff, and we went at it with our hatchets. We soon had in wood enough to roast a small beef. We poked the wood up next to the small rock that held the clog and chain, but not with our hands. A pole suited us all right for that. After poking in plenty of bark, we lit a piece and set the whole mass afire. Soon the smoke began to pour out in our direction. Now this was not where we wanted it to go, so we began to shovel snow with our snowshoes, and in a very short time the smoke was going somewhere else. The effect was what we wished, for the growls and coughs and sneezes made us step back a little farther and raise our guns in readiness to shoot. Frank said, "I guess he is the devil if he can stand that hot place." But he had hardly finished saying this when the snow, wood, and fire were flying in all directions. I thought the air would soon be full of cats, the way things were flying around inside there, but nothing came out except the sounds of struggles that we would have been glad to end, but we could not, for the smoke was so dense we could see nothing. In 2 or 3 minutes all was quiet, and we knew there was no cat to fear, so we threw on some snow to quench the fire. Then we began to pull the wood out. The last sticks pulled as if there was something on the ends of them, and there was, for there lay our cat. When the old cat made his dash to get out, he didn't free the chain from between the rocks, but landed in the hottest part of the blaze. We measured him with our guns and got quite accurate measurements. He was a trifle more than 9½ feet from his nose to the tip of his tail, and stood a trifle more than 26 inches high, but his hide was worthless, for the hair was all burned off. As we stood there looking at him, we both felt sorry that the old cat had to meet such a fate. We had thought that the smoke would drive him out so that we could shoot him in a humane way, for our rule was always to kill our game as quickly and easily as possible, so as not to cause unnecessary suffering. But then we recalled Frank's narrow escape and realized that if we had let him stay alive, there was no telling what trouble he may have brought to us. We now felt better about it. With thankful hearts we released his forefoot from the jaws of the big trap, which we carried back to camp, and as Frank hung it up that night, he said, "I wonder what will be the next thing we get in this trap." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. New hunting grounds. For the next 2 weeks it seemed to snow most of the time, and but very little game traveled. As we had caught most of the game that homed in that immediate locality, we decided to move our traps up the brook beyond where Frank had caught the foxy lynx. So the following Monday morning we loaded our sled with axe, saw, traps, blankets, and enough chuck, that is food, to last us about a week. At 11 o'clock we passed the last trap, and also the end of our snowshoe float. Then the hard work began, for our snowshoes would go down about 14 inches in the soft snow. We had to leave the sled, go around and break the road, and then go back and get the sled. We kept this up almost steadily for about 5 hours. A little past 4 o'clock we stopped, began to look about for a home. We finally selected a place beside an old dry stub of a tree. Frank went to scooping the snow away from the butt, and I went to cutting boughs for a bed. Before dark Frank had a good fire in the hole he had scooped out. After supper we tried to dry out, but we were so cold on the side away from the fire that we hurried to make our bed. We spread the boughs out on the hot ground and placed a thin rubber blanket on top of them to keep the moisture from us. Then we spread our woolen blankets over the rubber blanket, and our bed was ready. We did not have to sing each other to sleep that night. Slumber came almost as soon as we hit the boughs, nor did we wake until nearly morning. A little after sunup we were ready to go. We left everything that we could at the old stub, for here we had planned to build our second camp. As we went on, the game paths grew more plentiful. They seemed to be used mostly by moose and deer, as they wallowed down one slope and up the other. Soon the valley widened, and we came to a thick growth of cedars on both banks of the brook. The trees were large, and the first limbs were about 8 feet above the snow. Tracks were everywhere. It seemed to us boys as if all the animals in the North Woods had been having a picnic. We had never seen so many tracks before. But go as carefully as we might, no animal could be found in the swamp. The cedar swamp was less than a half-mile long. Beyond it, the banks of the brook were lower, and there was a larger open space on either side. Stunted trees grew beyond this open space. Frank was ahead, and as he came to a bend he stopped and said, "Don't move, something's coming." Then he raised his gun to his shoulder, but still I saw nothing. Then all at once round the bend walked or wallowed a big caribou, then another and another, and still on they came until we had counted 11. Such a sight! I began to get anxious, but dared not even whisper. The stunted trees had hidden us so completely that we had not been seen by the drove. I selected the third one and waited. On they came until they were within 50 yards. Then they stopped. There were 3 reports, and 2 of the caribou fell. I could not have shot any more if I had wanted to, for the snow flew in clouds, and they were around the bend and gone much quicker than we had supposed any animals of their size could move, especially in such a depth of snow. Frank's caribou dressed about 200 pounds, and mine 150, but before we had the meat taken care of, darkness began to come on. We made quick time back over the snowshoe float, and 2 happy boys crawled in between the blankets under a starlit sky. Fortunately for us, the weather was quite mild. We were not as sleepy as usual that night, and for a long time we lay awake and talked. We decided that this ridge would be the place to build our lean-to. We planned to spend 2 nights a week there, and to carry our furs to the home camp to stretch and dry. While we were eating breakfast the next morning, we saw just what we needed for our lean-to, a big rock with one side nearly flat. But the first thing was to finish taking care of our meat, so we put an axe and a few traps on a sled and started out, and in less than 3 hours we were at our fresh supply of meat. We finished removing the hides and put the refuse in one pile. As we had more meat than we could haul, we loaded the hindquarters and hides on the sled, and after carefully placing several traps around the offal, we said good enough until we return and build a house over it. We carried the forequarters to the nearest spruce tree, and after cutting off some strong limbs about 1 foot from the trunk, we cut a slit between the ribs and hung them up the way a butcher hangs up his meat. They would be much safer here, we thought, than on the ground. The return trip to our proposed campsite was much slower than the trip up in the morning. It was past 3 when we arrived at the flat rock where our supplies were. We now felt quite anxious, for the sun had clouded in and fine snowflakes filled the air. Our shelter was far from the best, and we ate supper on the move, for our exertion had caused us to perspire freely, and as we toasted one side, or tried to dry it, the other side would almost freeze. The snow began to come down in a businesslike way, and we saw that we were in for a good storm. We put some chunks of wood on the side of our bough bed, and then placed our sled crosswise on top of them as a sort of roof. This did not make our shelter wide enough, so we had to cut 4 or 5 small poles and lay them on beside the sled. On top of all, we put the caribou hides and a funny little home we had. It was past 10 when we slipped in between the blankets. The caribou hide surely did us good service that night. A little more than 6 inches of snow fell, and the next morning we swallowed our breakfast in the style of the lumberjacks at Northwest Carry. Then we started in to build camp number 2. Frank cleared the snow away, while I went to cutting poles. We placed all the small ends upwards against the rock, and spaced them about 6 inches apart. It took about 25 of these poles to make us a little framework for our wigwam. We had seen several dead cedars at the edge of the swamp, and from these we got loose bark enough to cover the poles with. We left a hole about 2 feet square at the extreme top for the smoke to go through. Then we piled spruce and balsam boughs on the bark. These took the place of nails for holding the bark snugly to the poles. Then we shoveled snow against the whole thing, and we had a comfortable little home. For a door we used one of the ever-useful caribou hides. When night came, our home was complete. The next morning, with the caribou meat on the sled, we started for the home camp. It was nearly dark when we dropped the shafts in front of our camp door. The old saying that when the cat is away the mice will play had proved true, for the boxes were scattered all around in our shed, and some were chewed and scratched. But the animal, whatever it was, had not succeeded in getting any of them open, because of the extra nails that we had driven in the lids before we left on our exploring trip. We piled the boxes up so as to make a sort of house of them, and then put part of the fresh caribou meat inside the enclosure. But we did not forget to put the big bear trap on guard. After carefully covering it with snow, we carried the remainder of the caribou meat inside the camp. Then we ate our supper and went to bed. It was past 2 o'clock when we were awakened by a racket in the shed. Something began to move, and then it came to a sudden stop. Sure enough, we had the thief, a good-sized bobcat. We had fastened the ring of the trap chain to the post that held our shed roof up, and that was what had stopped him so suddenly. We cut 2 sticks about 5 feet long, and with these we learned much of the quickness and power of the teeth and claws of our midnight visitor, before we sent him on to Rabbit Hollow. When we went back into camp, we counted up the days and found that this was Sunday morning, so we ate a lunch, crawled back into our bunks, and did not turn out again until nearly 11. For the next 2 days we took life a little easier, but on the 3rd morning we left for Camp No. 2 with the intention of being gone about 6 days, for we wished to put in many traps beyond the new camp. On the way up, a short distance beyond where Frank caught the cunning lynx, we sat down on the sled to rest, and were there but a few minutes when Frank caught a glimpse of something coming down off the hill. Then we kept perfectly quiet. On they came. Surely this was something big. As they came plainly into view, we saw it was a bull and a cow moose. They were going to cross our float about 75 yards ahead of where we were sitting, and it was a sight long to be remembered. The snow was so deep that more than half of their bodies was beneath the surface. The bull was ahead and was breaking the road for his lady, and he was very attentive to her. Every few minutes he would stop and look back to see if she was all right. When they came to our float, they stopped and stuck their noses up in the air and acted as if they were trying to get the scent of something that made those tracks ahead of them, whatever they were. But no, they would not cross. The bull turned slowly around and crowded ahead of the cow. Then he stopped and looked back at her. Finally he saw us, and the hair on his back slowly began to rise, but his gaze never left us. Then the cow sighted us, and I said to Frank, "Let's scare them before they do us." So we both yelled as loud as we could, and I fired my rifle into the air. They went up the hill in a different fashion from the way they came down, for when they went back all that was visible was a little of their heads. The snow flew as if thrown in the air by a small locomotive. We could have had them both, but our supply of meat was enough to last us till we should go out of the woods, and we didn't care to kill for the sake of killing. We found but little game in our traps below Camp No. 2, but above we met with better success. Where we had killed the caribou there had been a great hustling. Our traps were snowed under and refused to work, and it was lucky we had hung the forequarters of the caribou well up in the air, or we would have had but little left fit to eat. We divided the refuse up into 3 lots, and put some of our best traps by it, for we saw that something besides bobcats or lynx had been at work around it. Nothing came to our traps the first night. The next day we set several on the brook beyond. During the second night a fisher and a sable ventured near the traps, but not near enough to get caught. On the 4th day we found one of our big traps gone. It was easy to follow the trail made by the animal that took it, and not 200 yards away there he was. "Oh," Frank said, "we have caught someone's shepherd dog, and doesn't he feel cheap about it?" It surely did look like a shepherd, only its ears were not dropped. There was no fight in it at all. It acted as if it had been whipped and expected to get a lot more of it. But we didn't let it go to hunt its master, for Frank said it looked too much like the black wolf that had come so near fixing him by the old hemlock log earlier in the season. 2 bobcats and 3 lynx were the rest of the big game caught at the caribou refuse, and in a short time we had all the small fur bearers that were in that locality. When we found that there was nothing more for us to do, we began to plan something to keep us busy. The days had grown much longer, and the sun had begun to cut its way into every little nook that was protected from the wind, reminding us that our stay in the woods would be short. As we wished to get all the experience possible in our winter's work, we planned for an extended trip on the first good snow crust. We carried our supplies to Camp No. 2, and agreed to start from there. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How a bull moose almost got Frank. We did not have to wait long before the conditions were all we could ask for, and with a crust that would almost hold us without our snowshoes, we left the second camp with provisions for a 4-day trip in the woods. It was our intention to travel the same territory but once, so we had mapped out in our minds the different points of the compass to travel to each day, and on the 4th day came out somewhere near our starting place. Our plan was to travel northwards about 14 hours, westerly 14 hours, southerly 29 hours, and easterly 22 hours. We figured that this would bring us out about where Frank had caught the cunning lynx. Now this seemed easy enough, but things didn't work out as we had expected, and if experience was what we wanted, we surely got all we were looking for on that trip. The first day was glorious, and equipped with a blanket apiece besides our food, we covered a big distance. We passed through many moose and deer yards, and drove several deer into the crust, where the poor things could not move more than a short distance before they were at our mercy. But there was no sport in this, for it caused them so much misery. When we came to an especially large moose yard, Frank said, "Here is a chance for some fun." I shook my head and said, "Please excuse me this time, Frank. I had rather go around the yard than through." But he was ahead and said, "Oh, come on in." So in we went. In about 20 minutes we were at the end of the yard, and here we caught a glimpse of several moose breaking out into the crust. As they were going in about the direction that we wished to go, we followed on. But in a short time we saw signs that they were getting tired and sore. They had made for a thicket, and had partially circled it, and I saw they intended to go back into their yard. We had completely lost sight of them, and were standing still looking for them, when they broke out of the thicket and swung round into the path they had made coming up. There were 7 of them, and as they passed, Frank said, "Now isn't that a pretty sight? Aren't you glad you didn't go around?" And I had to acknowledge it was a wonderful sight. We stood and watched them until they had disappeared. We decided to cross the path the moose had made and swing up to the ridge, where it looked to be much more open and better traveling. We were about 50 feet from the moose trail when I saw a dandy big hunk of gum that Frank had gone by. "Don't you want it?" I called. As Frank didn't want it, I said, "Well, I do," and I got out my jackknife and began to dig around the beauty lump. Frank went on. But just then something happened. There was an old bull that had not gone up with the rest. He had hidden in the thicket and was then not more than 6 rods from where we were. I yelled, "Look out, Frank," but it seemed to me that I was more than 5 minutes saying it. The bull had figured on the charge he would make, and it happened to be at Frank, as he was in the lead. But Frank had not heard or seen him until I yelled, for he thought I was making all the noise. The moose had timed his fuse about right, for Frank had just started to cross the trail that the drove had gone up. They had made a trench about 4 feet deep and about 3 feet wide, and as Frank tried to step across this trench, the crust gave way under his snowshoes, and he slipped back into the moose trail. When I yelled, he looked up and saw the bull less than 25 feet from him, and coming for him at a speed that seemed impossible for any animal to make through such a depth of snow. I saw that something was the matter with Frank, but I was watching the moose. I grabbed my rifle and watched. I did not want to shoot unless I had to, but the distance between the moose and Frank was growing less so rapidly that I raised my rifle. I counted 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet, then I shot. Almost instantly another report came from Frank's gun. I fumbled around and tried to get a fresh cartridge for my rifle, but this was useless, for when the smoke had cleared, that moose was still, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. Could that moose have killed him? I had had a chance to shoot long before I did, but I did not wish to kill unless obliged to. It seemed as if 100 things flashed through my mind before I could get to where I could see him. Then I heard Frank's voice. "I'm all right," he called, but he did not get up until I tried to help him. One snowshoe was down under the snow, and one of the moose's big feet was on top of that. Frank said the faster he scrambled to get out of the moose path, the farther down he went, and he saw he must shoot to save his life. As he swung the gun on the moose and pulled, he felt himself twitch down still further into the snow. It seemed as if the moose struck at him as he pulled the trigger, and both barrels were discharged into the moose's neck, striking near the shoulder, tearing a hole more than 3 inches across and hitting the neck bone. Luckily for Frank, the moose had not moved after he had fallen. But the big foot had done its work, for underneath it was what was left of one of the snowshoes, with Frank's foot securely fastened to it. In a few minutes I had the snowshoe loosened and helped Frank out, but his leg pained him badly, and soon afterward it began to swell. When I got the snowshoe out, or what was left of it, the frame was all broken, but even if it had been whole, Frank could not have used it for several days. Now we were in for it. We sat down on the moose and took account of stock. As nearly as we could estimate, we were more than 20 miles from our home camp, for this accident had happened about noon on the second day. The next thing was a place to camp, and this was selected on the edge of the thicket where the old bull had stayed in wait for us. I built a lean-to and a bough bed, and as soon as I got Frank comfortable, I went to cutting wood. That night was a long one. Frank's leg pained him a good deal, and I had to keep heating small sticks of wood all night long and place them around his leg as carefully as possible. About daylight, the pain began to ease up, and poor Frank got a little sleep. We both dozed most of the forenoon. I was planning to make something to haul Frank back to camp on, but his leg was so much better the next morning, we thought it best to get an ash stick and make a bow for his snowshoe instead of a sled to pull him out. I found a pretty fair tree and split out a piece for a bow. All the tools I had were the axe and my jackknife, but with these I did the trick. On the second night with the moose there came a change in the weather. It began to cloud up before midnight, and big drops of rain began to spatter down. We pulled the moose hide over us with the flesh side out, and as we lay on top of our blankets, we felt that this monster hide was all we could ask for in a time like this, for it gave us plenty of warmth and was perfectly waterproof. It rained nearly all day, and when it cleared off, the wind began to blow a gale. We were well up on one side of the high ridge and got the full force of the wind. After I had put the old snowshoe filling into the new bow, we felt that there was but one thing to stay here any longer for, and that was Frank's leg. We were far from home and the comforts we now needed. Our bread was all gone, and we had meat to eat, though it was not very good, for the old bull was as tough as leather, and we had to pick out the tidbits in order to get anything good. There was lots of bulk, though, to make up for the poor quality. 5 nights we slept in the woods with the big bull, but on the 6th day Frank decided he was well enough to travel a part of the way at any rate, and so we cut off a lot of the best meat that was left. This was mostly tenderloin, with a little of the saddles. I cut 2 slender poles and whittled the bark off, and cut several long narrow strips of hide for strings. After our meat and blankets were carefully packed inside, I lashed the moose hide on top of the poles, for I feared that Frank's knee might give us trouble before we reached the camp, and we might need the hide again to camp under. We traveled very slowly the remainder of the day, and about 4 o'clock Frank said he had gone far enough. So we selected a thicket and prepared for one more night's sleep in the woods. That night we both said we were hungry, but somehow we could not eat much. That moose meat did not hit the right spot. But the next morning we heard the kit, kit, kit of a partridge as it came near our camping grounds, and I was doubly pleased when I found it had several followers. I got 3 out of the lot, and they made a welcome change in our diet. The next day Frank traveled very slowly, and I knew his leg was paining him badly, but there was not a word to let me know of his pain, for he was game. So I proposed an early halt, and as the clouds began to look threatening, we placed the moose hide on top again. We went to sleep that night happier than we had been the night before, for we believed that the home camp was only from 3 to 5 miles away. But before morning the storm began to come down. Not rain this time, but snow, and no let-up until early noon. I thought of going on and trying to find camp, but after we talked it over, we decided to stay together. I shot 2 partridges that day, but on account of the storm, we decided not to try to make the camp, for we didn't know exactly where we were. The next morning everything was beautiful. The snow had fallen quite damp, and most of it had frozen onto the limbs of the trees, and they were all bent down with the great weight of it. Frank's knee was getting better, and we were sure we could find some traces of the old float, or some spots on some trees, by noon at the latest. So on we traveled. We ate a late dinner that day, for we wanted to eat something besides moose meat and partridge. There were no signs of camp or anything that we knew, so we jogged on. My going ahead made it much better for Frank, but I began to feel very tired, twitching that moose hide all over the Lord only knew where. We felt sure that we were quite near, so we plodded on. Nothing looked familiar that day, and more than once I wished for our little home. The next morning we continued our course, for we thought it must bring us out to something we had seen before. The afternoon wore away slowly, and the traveling grew harder, as the ground was more uneven than before. We had decided to camp that night, and then go back one day's trip and hunt for some signs that we knew we must have passed. Oh, but I did hate that moose hide and the blankets. It seemed as if I had a good share of the world trailing behind me on the soft, slippery snow. We were selecting our camping place for the night when we saw a heavy growth of trees ahead. Frank said, "I think there is a swamp ahead. Let's go into it. There will be more shelter." But it was not a swamp that met our gaze as we broke through the first thick growth, but a river under its winter bed. Where were we? Nothing looked familiar to us, so we went to make preparations for another night in the woods, the 10th since the episode of the moose. I was cutting wood, and Frank was picking up boughs when he yelled, "Come here, I have found an axe mark. Yes, and a trap house. Yes, and a trap in it." I hurried over, and sure enough, there it was. But whose could it be? Then the truth began to dawn on us. We were at Ledbetter Falls, and this was our trap, and we were about 4.5 miles from our home camp. The snow had so changed the looks of everything that we had crossed our float somewhere and had put about 20 miles more than we expected on our trip. As the night was upon us, we laid ourselves down once more on the boughs. We felt mighty thankful that we were so near the comforts that we had left 10 days before. Breakfast was not eaten in the woods the next morning, but in a snug, warm camp, and 2 happy boys never before found home half so good as this. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My fight with a fisher. As the crust had helped us in our traveling, so it also helped many small animals that were glad to get away from their winter home and go a-roving, and this was all to our benefit. But one old fisher seemed to get the best of me. The first time I got him in my trap was a surprise to him. When I found one of my big traps sprung and empty, there was a surprise for me. Well, we played catch as catch can for more than 2 weeks. When he couldn't get at the bait in any way besides going over the trap, he would do that, and the next morning we would find the back of the house torn off and the bait gone. Finally, we proposed a new plan. Nearby was a ledge about 30 feet high. In one place there was an overhang of about 10 feet, which protected the ground below during storms. This was the place we selected to fool Mr. Fisher, for he almost always passed near this ledge on his trips. We cut a stunted spruce tree about 10 feet high, dragged it to the ledge, and placed the butt end upward under the overhanging rock. The top was quite thick, and to fool the fisher we twisted back 2 of the limbs that were next to the ledge and fastened them so that they left a little opening in about the right place to slip in a trap. But we didn't slip in any trap then. What we did put in was plenty of bait, and on the second morning we saw that the fisher had made a visit there. By the tracks on the snow it looked as if he had spent most of the night prowling around that spruce tree. He evidently thought that the trap must be somewhere around that bait, but he couldn't find out just where it was. He had finally dug down and come up nearly under the bait, and had got it. After we examined the place all we wanted to, we placed some more bait and smoothed the snow all off. That night he was back and got the bait again, but didn't make such a fuss as he did the night before. Well, we kept this up so long that he evidently thought we were all out of traps, and walked boldly into the open space rather than crawl through the thick top. Now this was what we wanted, so we went through the same moves that we had been going through, and finally we slipped 2 traps into the opening. We went away hugging ourselves, for we were sure we had 'em. That evening we tried to estimate the size of the fisher by the amount of our bait he had eaten. One thing we knew, and this was during the last 4 weeks he had got his living without much hard work. Before we had gone to bed the wind began to blow, and damp snow stuck to everything as it came pelting down. Then I began to feel worried, for I was afraid my traps would not work in much more snow than I had covered them with. But when morning came we found it had cleared and grown cold during the night. About 5 inches of damp snow had fallen. We talked the conditions over, and decided that it would be policy for us to cover all the ground possible, and to dig out the traps that might be snowed in. Before starting the day's trip, I wished many times for Frank's shotgun, and when I asked him if he would swap guns for that day, he said sure, and it was a lucky thing for me that we made the swap. The ledge where we had been feeding the fisher was about 2 miles from camp, and this place had more interest for me that day than all the rest put together. It seemed as if the float never was so long as it was that morning, and when I got inside of the ledge I was as wet as any muskrat that ever dug a lily root. The fisher had been there, for his tracks crossed the float and then swung toward the ledge. I crept up to the ledge as if I were still hunting a black wolf, for I could see tracks everywhere. I thought if making tracks was what he was doing that morning, I might possibly catch him at it, but I didn't see him. I walked quite near the tree where the traps were hidden. There was nothing in them, I knew, for I could see both poles sticking out of the snow. The fisher had done lots of running back and forth from one end of the ledge to the other, and I soon discovered what the trouble was. There were 2 different sizes of feet, and on following the tracks it seemed as if the big one had been chasing the little one back and forth. They had made a good path, and I followed to see where it led. The end was in a pile of rocks at one end of the ledge. Then I followed back to find out where the other end of the path led, and this ended in a hole about 3 feet wide at the bottom and 2 feet high, making a sort of triangular-shaped entrance. I saw that the hole was a big one, but in order to get a look inside, I had to lie down on my stomach and drag myself along about 2 feet. And then I saw what I wished to see. 2 small balls of fire of a greenish color glared in the depths of the hole. I pulled off my muskrat cap and stuck it in the hole, and wiggling back I said to myself, "I've got you this time." I knew the fisher would not go by the cap, and while the cap was keeping guard I looked the ledge over. There was no mark in the snow to indicate any other exit, so this gave me just the opportunity that I wanted. First I brought the traps and put them at one side of the hole, where the roof was about 10 inches high. Then I began to look for birch trees. There were no white birches in sight, but several yellow birches with their rough bodies showing plenty of bark, such as it was. So I went at it, and I think it was a good half hour before I got what I had considered plenty for the smoke-out act. I left a space over the traps, so if the fisher chose to come out, the chances were good of his getting caught, and I wouldn't have to shoot him. After all was ready, I crawled back into the hole, lit a match, and tried to set the bark on fire. It burned a little, but it didn't burn to suit me. I wiggled nearer and began to blow. This had the desired effect, for the smoke rolled out in good shape, and I knew lots of it was going where the fisher was. Then I heard something on the trap side, and did not have to move my head more than a foot when 2 round eyes peered at me from over the traps, and a sharp "Piska" sent me out of the hole with no slow movement, I can tell you. I could have touched the fisher's head with my hand, but I didn't care to just then. As quickly as possible I picked up the gun and scrambled away, yet somehow it seemed as if my snowshoes were everywhere but under me, and pointing in the right direction. As soon as I put 30 feet between myself and the fisher's temporary quarters, I turned right about face in double-quick time. I pulled back both hammers and waited. The smoke poured out in such volume that I knew my work would be a success, and not 2 minutes had elapsed before something black made a tremendous jump for its life. I had to swing the old gun around pretty fast to get it in line. Then I pulled. As the fisher was going straight for the spruce, His next bound carried him into some of the outer limbs, and wiggling and squirming, he tried to get through the top. I thought I must have wounded him badly, and I did not want to fire the charge of buckshot that remained in the gun, for fear of completely spoiling his beautiful fur. I saw that he had worked mostly through the top, and would naturally go to the other hole in the ledge, and so I made a run to get at him before he got clear of the top, and I did. The top lay at an angle about 45 degrees, and I thought I might reach over and hit him with a gun barrel and stun him. But this didn't work, for I was going so fast when I reached the spruce, my body didn't want to stop. My feet got mixed up with the limbs, and over I went. I could see that I was going to light on top of the fisher. He changed his mind about running away and turned to give battle. I was holding the gun in my right hand, and as I saw I was going on top of him, I threw all my strength into an effort to avoid a direct landing on him. I struck out with my left hand to keep out of the way as best as I could when I should hit the snow. The fisher was ready to spring, and as I saw him start to grab me in the face, I closed my eyes and twisted my head around as far as possible. And I shall never forget the snap of those white ivory teeth as they came together less than 6 inches from their mark. But my left arm was not long enough to reach hard bottom, so my face was completely buried in the snow, and it was 2 or 3 seconds before I dared to look up to see what had happened. When I did, I saw the fisher on his way to the other retreat. Without trying to get to my feet, I rolled over enough to get my other arm free and let the other barrel's contents do the rest of the work. I had not had a great while to get frightened in, but I had a longer time to get through shaking. I was mighty thankful that I still retained what little beauty nature had given me. I carried the traps back to the top and reset them for the other fisher, which I got the following morning. But I could not understand how the big one got over both those traps, which were set in so small a space, without springing either of them. That night when we skinned the big fisher, I saw that of the first charge I fired at him, only 2 BB shots had touched him, and these had not broken any bones. The spruce top was what had bothered him the most. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Out on a limb with a bear after me. Our sugar was getting low, and we had been looking for a maple growth to get a little sweet from. We found one whopping big maple up the brook, not more than 75 yards from camp. It stood in a little opening, and there were many long limbs that reached far out as if they were trying to touch their nearest neighbors. This tree, we knew, would yield us a big amount of sap. Still farther up the ridge there were about 10 that we thought might give a fair amount of sap, so we began to prepare our little sugar works. We must have some buckets or something to catch the sap. Now we hadn't any buckets, so we started in to make something that would answer. First we cut down some yellow birch trees that were about 10 inches across, and then we sawed them into blocks about 2 feet long. We got 6 of these and stood them on end, and after marking them, we drove the axe down through with a maul and opened each block neatly into halves. Then we chopped and hewed them out until they would hold from 5 to 8 quarts. This used all our spare time for nearly 10 days before we had 12 respectable sap troughs ready for our sugar works. The spiles we had to make 1½ inches across, for that was the size of our auger. Our outfit was not ready any too soon, for the first morning we tapped, the sap almost ran out instead of dripping, and on our return to the big maple we had enough sap to satisfy us as to the quality of this tree. Our trapping lines were neglected that day, for at noon we had a pail apiece, and were out to see what our new venture had brought us. And we were not surprised to find most of the troughs full and running over. We now found that our means to handle the sap was limited, for one small kettle was all we had to boil down with. But we kept that busy all afternoon, and that night we had maple syrup on our flapjacks. And wasn't it good? We decided that on the next day one of us should take the kettle up to the big maple and boil all the sap possible, and at night bring it to camp and make it into sugar. All we wanted was enough to last us until we got out of the woods, and we figured on about 25 more days more to stay. The next night Frank said the sap was running fine, and when we counted the cakes of maple sugar, we had 14. When I awoke Sunday morning, I told Frank that I was going to take the pails and get some sap to have to drink during the day, and he said he would have breakfast ready when I returned. The snow was frozen hard, and I did not put on my snowshoes, but skipped over the hard float with a pail on each arm, and I thought of home and wondered how Father would get along that spring without me. Before I was aware of it, I was at the big maple. Yes, the trough was full and running over, but I did not touch this sap, for I wanted to fill my pails about 2/3 full at the farthest trees, and then on my return I would finish filling them from this sweetest of all the sap. I'd made the rounds and was back again to the big maple. I was afraid that I would spill some, so I lay down and drank from one side of the trough before I moved it. Then, after quenching my thirst, I got up and was turning the contents into the partially filled pail when I heard something directly behind me. On turning my head, I saw the maker of the slight noise. There in the snowshoe float, and not 12 feet from me, was a big bear. He was just rising up on his hind feet. His lips were drawn up, and low growls began to indicate his feelings. From 12 to 8 feet was but a second's walk for him, and I was paralyzed. To do something quick was the one thought, and the sap bucket was the first thing in the line of defense. With all my strength, I let it go as swift as possible to the head of the bear, and my aim was good. It must have been a surprise to him, for it knocked him almost over. I had no time to look or decide what to do. The first impulse was to climb, and that I did. The spiles were driven in about 3 feet from the snow, and the lower limbs were about 8 feet above the spiles. Now this was my only chance, and I saw it. I sprang with all my might for safety, and it seemed as if my hands would never reach the low sweeping limbs so near. But fortune favored me, for I got a good grip. Yet when I went to swing myself over, something caught me by one foot, and I came near to going down much quicker than I went up. But my grip held, and so did the bear's, and for a few seconds we both pulled. Then something gave way, and I swung on to the low limb, and Bruin dropped on all fours with something in his mouth. I felt no pain, but wondered if I had lost a foot, for there on the snow was one of my moose-hide moccasins. I had not had any time to yell before, but I saw that now was my chance to get in a hearing before it was too late, and yell I did. I could see the end of the camp, but I knew that Frank would not be looking for me out on a maple limb. The 3rd or 4th time I yelled, I got results from Frank. As soon as Bruin found that what he had was not good to eat, he began to climb the tree, and I began to work out on the long, slender limb. As soon as he reached this limb, I saw that he was no tightrope walker, but I did think that he would hang on the limb and get me from the lower side. The bear was standing on the limb with 3 feet, and the 4th was placed on the body of the tree to help hold his balance. He was in this position when there came a yell from down the snowshoe float, and Bruin stopped his wiggling and looked down that way. That was what was wanted, and a buzz reached my ear before I got the report of the rifle. Bruin bit at the thing that pricked him from behind the foreshoulder. 4 quick shots in succession from about 50 yards had their effect, and gradually the claws relaxed their hold, and a ball of black fur rolled off and fell on the white snow below. Bruin was soon past any more trouble-making. At first I had been pretty well scared, but now a reaction had come, for as Frank walked up with my rifle on his arm, and a broad grin that I will never forgive him for, he said, "Next time, take your gun along." I was so provoked with him that I forgot all about my fright. I dropped off the limb, picked up my moccasin, and outside of a few scratches and tooth marks I was all right. The sap was all spilled, and the one spile was broken off, but in return for it we had a fine black bearskin, and my experience was never to be forgotten. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The last days of winter. We'd planned on taking a trip across the East Branch and toward what is now called Secatian Pond, but our previous 10 days camping trip was all we cared for at the present time. So we cut the trip down to 1 day, and with a big lunch in our pockets, we were ready to start at the first peep of daylight, which now came rather early. It had frozen quite hard during the night, and a few fleecy clouds had dropped down about an inch of snow over the crust. We thought that this would give us a good opportunity to see what was using this nice crust besides ourselves. A moose yard had lost all its charm for us, and the poor deer could go but a short distance after leaving their yard, so we avoided both as much as we could. What we wanted was to find out the amount and kind of fur that was traveling around in this section. At about 11:30 we began to see many fisher and sable tracks, and a little past noon we rounded the point of a steep ridge and came out on a bog or swamp land that was about 1/2 mile wide and 3/4 of a mile long, with what looked like many tents all over it. These tent-like affairs were spruce trees from the tops of which the snow had thawed, making them look like little conical-shaped tents. The bottoms of the trees were still loaded down so that there was not a sign of a limb in sight, and tracks everywhere. What was it all about? We began to look the bog over to see why there were so many tracks. We soon had the problem solved. Before noon we had not seen so many rabbit tracks, but as we neared the swamp we saw more and more of them. The snow completely hid the lower limbs of the trees and made wonderful snow houses. There were holes all around those trees where the rabbits had dug through the walls of snow. Some of the largest had 8 or 10 openings, and none had less than 2. Now, these were their only fortifications, and the ways of escape were cleverly planned. We estimated that there must have been several hundred bunnies in the town, but not one did we see. Fisher, sable, and fox had entered this quiet little town, and tracks showed that many hot races had been run, without one sign that a single rabbit had been caught napping. Frank said as we stood and wondered at their swift-footed pursuers, "Surely this is a city in the wilderness." And so we returned to camp, well pleased with what we had seen and learned. During the next few days the water began to gurgle under the snow, and in many places to show itself, and as we saw that our winter's trapping was near its end, we made all possible preparations for an early start on our homeward trip. All the small furs we had packed in boxes and put in the shed, but the big moose and bear hides we left in camp to dry. We had found an old dead cedar that would make us a nice storehouse. It was down next to the spring brook, and about opposite the big maple where the bear wanted my company. It had evidently been dead for many years, and the inside was all rotted out, leaving a hollow more than 15 inches across. During some gale the roots had refused to hold, and it had toppled over. One root had stayed in the ground, and as the trunk went over, a sliver, about 4 feet long and more than 6 inches across, broke out next to the butt. This made an opening into the hollow of the log. Now the tree was perfectly dry, for the opening was on the other side, and in it we began to store the traps and things we should want to use in our next winter's trapping, for we had fully decided to return the coming winter, as we saw we could better ourselves in many ways. As fast as we got 10 or 15 traps to camp, we would heat a pail of water boiling hot, then pour fresh grease on the water until we had about 1/2 inch of grease on top. Then we would warm our traps and dip them into the pail, and when they came out they would have a thin coat of grease that would prevent their rusting. With a pole we poked the greased traps as far as possible toward the top of the hollow cedar. It was about the first day of April that winter left us for good. When we woke that morning, the rain was coming down more like a shower than a rainstorm, and we knew that the ice could not stand many hours of this downpour. The little brook that came from the pond was running over the ice at noon, and at dark it had risen 2 feet more. But when we ventured out at 9 that night, a few stars showed us that the storm was over, and the warm air seemed like a breath from the southland. As Frank closed the camp door, he said, "Goodbye, winter. We are sorry to see you go, after all." But we both longed for home, and when we went to bed that night we were not sleepy. We lay and talked until it must have been past 10 o'clock, when I heard a funny noise. I said, "Listen." We both listened, and it soon grew a little louder. Finally, we could hear it very plainly. It sounded like a whirlwind a long way off, and it kept growing louder. We jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. When we opened it, we knew what the noise was all about. The ice was going out. We could hear the roar of the grinding and crashing as the big cakes were shoved into the woods, breaking small trees that could not stand the terrific pressure. We listened until the jam had passed us, and then went back to bed. We wished more than once that it was daylight so that we could see this wonderful sight. In the morning, we intended to go and get something of an idea of its power and grandeur. We dozed with thoughts of our homeward start, and then we were both awakened by a sharp cling. Something inside our camp had made the sound. Frank said, "What in the world can that be? I'm going to light a match and find out." And what a surprise for us! The water was more than a foot deep on the floor, and after the lantern was lit, we began to see the condition of things. The dishpan was floating around. My moccasins were feet up. Our kindlings were everywhere, and everything was on the move, for the water was rising, and this caused an eddy in which things were traveling. Our bunk was soon afloat, and we had to climb up on a broad shelf that was quite near the highest point in our camp. It was lucky for us that we had made this to hold some heavy supplies. We pulled up with us 2 blankets that were still dry, and were going to wrap ourselves in them, but I saw that the guns and ammunition were going to get wet, so I had to go and get them. And wasn't the water cold? I'm sure of one thing, and that is a broad shelf never held 2 more thoroughly frightened boys than we were that night, for we had no idea where the high water mark would be. At 12 o'clock the water was within 10 inches of our shelf, and we thought surely we should have to take our guns and knock off 1 or 2 splits so that we could get out on the roof. But this proved to be the limit, and when the water began to drop, it went down much faster than it had risen. However, this broad shelf was not intended for a bunk, and we had many pains without taking them before the water was out of the camp. We found, much to our joy, that 3 of the important things were dry, and these were guns, ammunition, and matches. We had no one to blame but ourselves for the flood. We should have gone up where the banks were much higher and built out of the way of the heavy spring freshets and ice jams that might form, and flood us out. But these things we learned that winter as part of our education in the North Woods. What a mess everything was in! Our box of furs were all out of place. Some were gone, but 5 were in sight. Suddenly Frank said, "Where are our canoes?" We had fastened 2 poles up about 5 feet from the ground, and had placed the canoes on top of them, bottom upwards, and after every heavy snow we would clear them off to keep it from springing them. If they had gone down the river we would have been in for it, for we were about 75 miles from Greenville, and rafting down would be a pretty serious job. But before dark we found the small one. It had floated up the brook and had caught in a clump of bushes. Our wood was all gone, and surely this was the very time we wanted to dry out. We worked hard all day trying to straighten things out. Long past midnight we laid ourselves down and slumbered round our many troubles. When Old Sol peeped through the spruce branches the next morning, he shone down on a camp containing 2 downhearted boys. The little flour we had was all wet, and what little saleratus was left in the can had dissolved. Our furs were all wet, and these would have to be dried. One of our boxes we never found. Our other canoe had nearly reached the river before it got hung up in a clump of friendly maples. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Home again. The next 10 days were days of hard work, and if I should try to describe them exactly, many pages would be covered with the unpleasant tasks that had floated to our cabin door. The morning of April 15th found us with everything in readiness for a start on our homeward trip, but before going I wrote on a smooth place that I hewed off with the axe over the door, "This camp will be occupied September 20th, 1876, by F. W. and E. Thomas." With a bit of heartache, we stepped into our canoes and were on our way toward the homes that we had left more than 7 months before. As we paddled out of our hiding place into the river, the water caught our canoes, and down the west branch we went at a speed that almost frightened us. When we had gone up, the water had been low and shallow, but today the river was bank full, and without any exertion, it seemed as if we were making more than 10 miles an hour. We had not been on the river but a few minutes before we saw where the ice jam had formed. The trees were scraped, and many small ones were broken. Soon we got accustomed to the swift movement, and found there was but one thing to do, and that was to keep in the middle of the stream. There were no chances to see or shoot any game, for we were kept busy avoiding the trees that had been undermined and toppled over into the water. Usually there were only a few roots holding them, so that they swung round with the current, the heavy branches reaching over treacherously to swamp our canoes. The roar of the falls reached our ears much sooner than we had expected, but we had talked this over and decided that if the water was high enough to cover the small boulders, there would be no danger in running the falls with our light loads. When we got there, the water was smooth in the middle and feather white on both sides. Frank was a little ahead, and he turned his head around and yelled, "Shall we go?" I nodded my head and yelled, "Sure, go on." But this he said he never heard. Over we started. It was the first fast ride I had ever had on the water. We were not more than 4 canoe lengths apart, but we both had business of our own, and it was each one for himself. I think I am safe in saying that we made this mile in less than 5 minutes, and we were soon slowly floating in the smooth water below Gulliver's Falls. Even with all the speed we had made, we knew that it would be impossible for us to make Northwest Carry that night, so we paddled into a little cove about 5 miles below the falls. Here we selected a camping site for the night. Once more the old moose hide served us, but this time we were in far better spirits than when we were lost, and Frank was suffering from an injured leg. With the big hide under us and 2 blankets over us, we were sung to sleep that night by a big hoot owl that was roosting on a nearby stub. We had reasons that I will tell you of later for not sleeping late the next morning. At daylight we were paddling, and at 11 o'clock our bows touched the shore of the Penobscot end of Northwest Carry. We did not draw lots to see who should stay with the canoes. We both struck out for the Carry house and ran as fast as we could. When we stepped over the threshold, we said, "Dinner for 6. There will be 2 of us to eat it, and please don't serve meat of any kind." For the last 12 days we had lived wholly on meats of different kinds, and our appetites were just right for a big meal. Nor did we look up or speak until we had eaten 2 rows of biscuit on the biggest tin plate we had ever seen. I will say that even the lumberjacks could not keep up with us at that meal. We found the oxen at our disposal, and before night our canoes were on Moosehead Lake, and our furs were locked in one of the storehouses. But here we must stay for a few days, for the ice was not quite all out of the lake. On the morning of April 23, the ice was all gone, and with a favorable wind we left for Greenville, but we did not arrive there until the night of the 2nd day. Then we stored our canoes for the summer, and after finding out what railroad connections we could make, I sent a dispatch that read as follows: Nathaniel Thomas, Canton Mills, Maine. We will be at Livermore Falls Thursday the 27th on 3:20 train. Both well. E. Thomas. Did the people look at us? I should say they did. Well, it was not surprising that they did, for we must have made a wild appearance as we walked down the streets. We had on our ratskin caps, buckskin jackets with rawhide thongs for belts, buckskin breeches, and moosehide moccasins, and under our arms we carried our homemade snowshoes and our guns. When we arrived at Livermore Falls, Father was there to meet us, and on the way back to Hartford that day, the old thoroughbrace wagon was loaded with as valuable a load as old Bill ever stretched the tugs on. When we reached the Canton post office, Father stopped to get the mail, and in a few minutes a crowd of our boy friends gathered around us with handshakes that gave a welcome we knew was not put on. The next stop was at the grist mill, for Father had left a bag of wheat to be ground into flour when he was on his way to and from the falls. As Father drove up to the platform, old Miller Hutchinson threw the bag of flour on, then the bag of bran, and middlings with a string tied round the middle to keep them separate. We were now within 2 miles of our home in North Hartford. The road took us around the end of Whitney Pond, and I am sure that it never looked so small as it did that day. From here on, everyone we saw welcomed us home. As we passed the little white cottage where Frank Richardson, the violin maker, lived, we caught a glimpse of him raking around some bushes. He was a small white-haired old man, and he was so intent on his raking that he did not notice us until we were right beside him. As he glanced up, he saw my father and said, "How do, Nathaniel?" Then he spied us. "Oh, boys," he called out. "Well, well, glad to see you back." Each one of our neighbors that saw us gave us a similar welcome as we rattled along the road toward home that day. It seemed mighty good to us to see the old familiar sights again, and to meet our friends and neighbors after our long winter in the woods, all alone. As we came in sight of my home, we saw a horse and a 2-seater in the yard, and Frank cried, "It's my father's rig." But before we were in the yard, 2 little girls came running across the lawn with open arms. They were Frank's sisters, Priscilla and Henrietta. We called them Puss and Et for short. In less than 5 minutes there were many wrinkles pressed into our leather jackets. It was night before we had our furs stored inside the corn crib. As soon as possible we were going to Boston to dispose of them. Several hours after Frank and the girls went home, I reached up on the mantelpiece, picked a match from the box, and with it lit a tallow dip for a light to climb the narrow stairs to a low, unfinished chamber. That night the moon rose in a cloudless sky, and as it shone on a little old farmhouse in North Hartfield, its beams fell on the floor beside a snow-white cot, and by it knelt a boy that gave thanks to his heavenly Father for watching over him and caring for him through the long cold winter months in the north woods of Maine. End of chapter 17. Section 18 of In the North Woods of Maine by E. Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Notes on Maine Animals. Thinking that this little book may fall into the hands of someone not familiar with the common northern animals, that a few facts concerning the animals we came upon during our winter's hunting and trapping might help the reader better to understand our experiences, I shall give here a brief description of each of the more important animals that we met while in the North Woods. The moose. The moose is the largest of all the animals in the North Woods. There is only one species found in Maine, but the individuals often vary. Some are black and others gray. The black variety is usually shorter than the gray variety, and its body is much heavier in proportion. Its antlers are not so heavy or of so great a spread as those of the gray variety, but the bell or dewlap, which is a long ornamental strip of hair-covered skin that hangs down from under the throat, is much prettier than the one found on the gray variety. The height of the black variety is from 4 1/2 feet to 5 1/2 feet, and its body does not have the slope from the foreshoulders to the hips that the gray has. The gray variety is built more on the lines of a racehorse, as far as thickness is concerned, and the height varies from 5 1/2 to 6 1/2 feet. But it is seldom that they attain the latter height, although I have seen them a trifle higher. The spread of the antlers averages about 4 feet. The web of the horn is from 6 to 10 inches wide. This growth of horn depends greatly upon the animal's age and how he wintered. If the snow is not too deep and the crust too severe, he comes through the winter in a more healthy condition, and is sure to grow a heavier and better developed set of antlers. The moose enjoys a soft, spongy lily root, and will walk out into the pond until his back is completely covered by the water, and will then put his head down to the bottom. Many times I have seen a moose rise out of the water after being out of sight for 1/2 minute to a full minute. He generally comes up with a good mouthful of the lily roots, and as he munches away, he slowly turns his head around and uses his keen eye to survey the nearest shore that might contain an enemy. In the winter, moose live mostly on maple, alder, poplar, and moosewood, and if the limbs are too large to chew, the moose will strip the bark off with their teeth as high as they can reach. The time for calling moose is in the fall, from September 15 to October 15, though the law forbids shooting until much later in the season. The moose's flesh is coarse but generally of very fine flavor, and as for the little delicate tidbits, why, your life is not complete unless you have eaten a dish of moose-lip soup. The woodland caribou. The woodland caribou that roam the north woods are about one-third the weight of the moose. The largest I ever saw weighed about 400 pounds. It is very seldom that they exceed 300. The long moss-like lichen that hangs down from the tamarack and the spruce trees is their choicest food, and if they cannot reach it in any other way, they will stand on their hind legs and knock off all they can reach with their forefeet. As for snowshoes, nature puts them on the caribou for keeps. When the deep snows come, there is no yarding as with the deer and moose. The caribou's feet are opened out, and the dewclaws, or false hoofs, on the back of the ankles are turned so that the bearing surface is almost 4 times as great on snow as when the animal walks on hard ground. The call of the caribou cannot be imitated, as far as I know. I've been within 100 feet when they called, and it was impossible for me to make any noise that sounded even a little bit like the call. As nearly as I can describe it, the first part is a little explosive quality, and sounds as if someone were trying to blow logs open with powder, and the charge blew out. The last part is something like a partridge drumming. The antlers are longer and somewhat flattened in comparison to a deer's antlers. They generally have 2 points that reach down toward the nose, but they vary much in growth, and seldom can 2 be found that are similar. The deer. The deer, the woodland caribou, and the moose all belong to the deer family. In fact, the word deer is sometimes used to include all the members of this great family. There is only one species of deer found in Maine, the Virginia deer. This species is found in all the eastern states, but in some localities the individuals differ a little in appearance from those in another locality. The black bear. The black bear is a very good still hunter, but bugs, berries, and fish are all acceptable to him. If there is a bee tree in the woods, he knows where it is, and if he doesn't get the honey, it is because the tree is too solid for him to tear to pieces. About the first snow finds him curled up in his winter quarters, and he is as quiet for the next 6 months as he was lively for the past, when he was filling up for his long fast. The panther. The panther is the largest of the cat family in the north woods, and though a powerful fighter, he is a cautious cat that will skulk out of sight and watch for a chance to spring on his prey unawares. His lungs are small, and his great swiftness is only for a short time. An Indian once related to me how he saw a fight between a bear and a panther. I shall give it to you as nearly as I can in his own words. "Me take 'em gun go hunting some day. No see much. Me sit down on log. Me watch. P'raps me see somefin. Me sit long time. By me hear somefin. Me look sharp. Me see bear come on run. Me pull up gun to shoot. Bear stop quick. Go dig big hole in ground. Me no shoot. Bear lay down and hole dig. Me look, no see nuffin. By some big catty come on run. See bear stop quick. No jump on bear. Walk round 1, 2, 3 whole lot times. Then jump on bear. Bear grab cat. Hug hard with front legs and bite. All time scratch with hind legs. No let go till cat all dead. Then bear get up, walk round cat. Then me shoot bear." "Well then," I said, "you got both the skins." "Yes, me got bear skin. He good. Cat skin not much good. Bear tore whole lot." The Indians call these cats Indian devils. The way they used to get them was to kill a deer and place its body beside a large tree. Then they sharpened a lot of hardwood stakes and drove them into the ground around the deer's body. When the panther sprang from the tree on the body of the deer, 1 or 2 stakes would be sure to stick into him and kill him. The fisher, or black cat, is one of the quickest animals that I have ever seen move. They are from 30 to 40 inches long. There are but two animals in the North Woods that can whip them. These are the bear and the panther. The fisher weighs from 8 to 15 pounds, and what he lacks in size is made up in strength and quickness. I was fishing one day at the outlet of a brook where it emptied into the lake. There was a wide sand beach, and the water had cut a narrow channel for several rods into the lake. I had dropped anchor on the edge of the channel and was fly fishing. A friend who was with me had got tired of fishing and had settled himself quietly in the stern of the boat, watching the trout jump at the flies. We heard a noise in the bushes, and out came a rabbit, and not 15 feet behind him was a fisher. The rabbit ran down the beach, and at every jump the fisher gained on him. But the rabbit knew the best moves to make, and none too quick he turned and ran up the beach and past us. On this turning game the fisher lost much ground, and on the straightaway he would outrun the rabbit. They kept this up for 4 or 5 trips up and down the beach, and all the time the fisher was shortening the distance between himself and the rabbit. We sat perfectly quiet and did not make a sound during this race for life. In a few moments the rabbit saw he must try something besides this dodging game, or he would lose his life, for the fisher was not over 2 feet behind him. So as the rabbit came back up the beach, he jumped into the water and swam straight for our boat, and as he came alongside I reached over and picked him up by his ears. When I put him down in the bottom of the boat, he did not offer to jump out, but crawled under one of the seats. The fisher stopped so quickly that he hardly wet his feet. When he saw us, he let out a piskia and ran back into the woods. We could hear the poor rabbit pant for a long time after we rescued him. And strange to say, he never tried to get out of the boat, but when we got to camp I picked him up again by his ears, and this time placed him on a friendly domain. He showed his appreciation by his quick scampering into the brush and out of sight. The fisher belongs to the weasel family. His fur is one of the most valuable furs worn today. The beaver. The beaver belongs to the large family of rodents, or gnawers. He is about the color of a woodchuck, a reddish-brown. He is larger than the muskrat, one of his distant relatives, and while the muskrat's tail is round, or nearly round, the beaver's tail is flat and wide. The beaver uses this tail as a rudder, and also as a means of signaling to other members of his family. His gnawing teeth are as sharp as chisels, and with these he can cut down a large-sized tree. The beaver is one of the most intelligent animals in the North Woods, and if I should try to describe fully what I know of its wisdom, it would require several pages. There is much difference of opinion as to how a beaver carries dirt, and how he works this dirt into his dam. Most naturalists now agree that he carries it between his forefeet and his body, pressed against his chest in a solid mass. Flashlight photographs have been taken to prove that this is the way he does it, but many hunters and trappers believe that he carries the earth to the dam on his broad flat tail. The following story, which may or may not be true, was told to me by a trapper and woodsman who caught a beaver kitten when it was quite small. The young beaver, so the hunter said, soon learned to recognize his master, and in a short time showed great affection for him and would enjoy being fondled as much as any house cat. One day the hunter wished to use an old pail that was somewhat dried up. As he brought the pail into the camp full of water, he saw that if he put it on the table, all the tin dishes would soon be wet, so he set it in the middle of the camp floor. The water began to trickle out, and where there were no cracks in the floor to receive it, it formed little puddles. This had no sooner begun than the quick eye of the beaver noted it, and he ran outdoors and found some loose dirt. He backed into the dirt until his trowel tail was loaded, and then returned to the leaky pail. He dropped the dirt beside the pail, then turning about he placed it in the shape of a dam around the pail. He repeated these performances until he had the pail completely enclosed with a small embankment. Soon the pail was empty, and all the water had drained through the cracks in the floor. When the beaver saw that there was no more work to do, he climbed up into the hunter's lap, looked at the dam and empty pail, and then into the hunter's face, with actions that expressed his mind nearly as well as words could. Then he cuddled down in the arms of his master, who gave him some well-earned caresses. This was his first practical dam building, and he had done a good job. The sable. The sable is a little animal about twice the size of a gray squirrel. His body is about the shape of a mink, but his head resembles that of a young fox. When he makes up his mind to have a squirrel for dinner, you would be fortunate to see the race. A sable goes from limb to limb in the tallest trees, and you would think it was a flying rather than a running race. Mr. Squirrel knows that, unless he finds a small hole to get into at once, Mr. Sable's bill of fare for his next meal will be a plump, fat squirrel served on a limb. The otter. The otter is not so swift as the sable on land, but in the water his speed compares favorably with that of the sable in a tree. Let him see a fish, and the story of the race is very brief. In a short time there will be just one less fish to hunt Helgramites. The mink. The mink is about the size of a gray squirrel. He is also a fish-eater, though young birds and mice do not come amiss when he is hungry. But his choicest meal is not complete without a young muskrat for dessert. The mink, the otter, and the sable all belong to the same family as the fisher. The lynx. The bobcat and the lynx are nearly the same. The lynx is a trifle taller and longer, with tassels or tufts on its ears. The color is grayish with a little brown intermixed. The height is from 18 to 22 inches. The body is about 2 feet long, and the weight varies from 20 to 35 pounds. Lynx are great fighters when cornered, and they can surely make night hideous with their caterwauls. The muskrat. Poor Jerry Muskrat, chased by every other animal, has a big job to look out for himself. He lives on grass and lily roots, but fresh water clams are his choicest food. His table is a flat rock or log that is mostly submerged. Not only the four-footed animals, but the owls have an eye out for him, and many, many times his hole in the mud is heaven for him. The raccoon. The raccoon, or coon as it is often called, is not closely related to any of our common northern animals, although he is sometimes classed with the bear. He weighs from 20 to 40 pounds, but compared with the bobcat or the lynx, his fighting qualities are very poor. Coons will eat fish, meat, bugs, and worms, and if the garbage dump is near your campground, you will often find that they have been there and cleaned up all the different kinds of food that their taste fancies. The fox. The fox is one of the shyest animals. He depends more on his nose than his eyes to keep him out of trouble. One time I was crossing a bog in a locality very seldom traveled by man. It was midwinter, and the snow was more than 3 feet deep on a level. The previous night about 6 inches of snow had fallen, and as I walked through the rush tops, my attention was called to many fox tracks. So I began to hunt for the cause, and soon found it. There was something in the snow, and the foxes were afraid of it, but still they wanted it. They had gone as near as they dared, and had pawed the snow away, leaving a small pyramid about a foot across and more than 10 inches high. I questioned much in my mind what could be in that little heap of snow, so I walked up to it and carefully brushed the snow away. And there in the middle was a part of a muskrat's foot. Now this was so far back in the woods that I doubt if the foxes had ever seen or smelled a steel trap. Yet even here they were as suspicious and shy as if they had always known about traps. I thought many times of the story of Samson catching 300 foxes and tying firebrands to their tails, and sending them forth on their work of destruction. I should like to know his receipt for trapping them, for I never had very good luck at it. The wolf. The timber wolf is one of the most destructive of all animals, for he must have the choicest animal food there is. Young deer and moose are his favorite prey. Wolves are great rovers, and they easily find and hunt down the young animals upon which they live. They generally hunt in packs, and it is very seldom that one of them will give the hunter even a flying shot. Their fur is of but little value. Many very interesting stories about them have been told by the early settlers of Maine, but at the present time there are few, if any, wolves in that state. Both the wolf and the fox belong to the dog family. The partridge. While the partridge is not an animal in the popular sense, I'm including it here because it is a characteristic bird of the deep woods, and because it is an important source of food, both to the hunter and to such woods animals as the fox, wolf, and lynx. The partridge's real name is ruffed grouse, but it is called partridge throughout the northern states. It is about the size of a small hen, and is the wildest and gamiest bird of the woods. One who has never heard it start up suddenly from a spot a few feet off and go thundering away through the trees would doubtless be startled by the racket it makes. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the partridge is the drumming sound that the male makes during the nesting season in the spring, and again in early fall. It is a sound hard to describe. It commences with a slow, hollow thump, 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 and gradually increases to a series of rapid notes, much like the roll of a snare drum. The sound seems to fill the air and to come from all sides at once. The question as to how he does this drumming has always been much disputed. From my observation, however, I am certain that he does it in the following manner. He raises his wings high above his back, and then brings them very quickly and forcibly against his body. The sound is made by the wings striking the air which is imprisoned between his wings and his body. When the last part of the roll is given, he turns his head over backward and closes his eyes for a few seconds. The observer can take advantage of this peculiarity by creeping up a little closer each time the bird gets to this point in his drumming. So if the observer has patience and uses extreme care, he may be able to watch the drummer at close hand. In the spring the drumming partridge usually mounts a log, and when he resumes his drumming again later in the season, he does not confine himself to one log, but runs through the thickets, hopping first on a log to drum, and then perhaps to a stone or a small knoll. It is interesting also to see how nature has provided the partridge with a means to keep itself from sinking too deeply into the heavy snows of the winter woods. During the fall a set of tough, bristly hairs begin to grow from the edges of each toe. By the time the deep snows have arrived, these hairs have formed a network between the bird's toes, so that Mr. and Mrs. Partridge really walk on snowshoes during the winter. End of section 18. Notes on Maine Animals. End of In the North Woods of Maine by E. E. Thomas.